Centuries ago, Zen masters discovered something profound. True peace doesn't come from trying to still your mind, but in letting your mind return to its natural, quiet state. Tonight, we will go on a journey through gentle teachings that remind us that peace is not something to achieve, but something to return to. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. These aren't lessons to learn or puzzles to solve. They're whispered truths from the heart of Zen Buddhism, each one a small lantern lighting your path toward deep, restorative sleep. There's no right way to listen, no wisdom you need to grasp, no meaning you must find. Just moments of presence, flowing from one quiet story to the next, each one drawing you deeper into the spaciousness that lives beneath all your thoughts. So settle in now. Let your shoulders drop, let your jaw soften. Just relax and listen. At a mountain monastery known for its rigorous training, 2 monks had been assigned to share the daily practice of walking meditation. The monastery's meditation path had been built many years earlier, constructed from thousands of old bricks that had been donated by local villagers. Over the decades, weather and time had taken their toll on the walkway. Some bricks had become loose and wobbly, others had cracked or broken completely, and still others stuck out at odd angles, creating an uneven surface that required careful attention while walking. Every morning after their sitting meditation, the 2 monks would walk this path together in silence, practicing the slow, mindful movement that was an essential part of their spiritual training. The path circled through a beautiful garden area, past ancient trees and alongside a small stream, creating what could have been a peaceful and contemplative environment for practice. The first monk, however, found the condition of the path to be a constant source of irritation and distraction. Each morning as they began their walking meditation, he would start his internal commentary almost immediately. "This path is absolutely terrible," he would think to himself, his mind filling with criticism and complaint. "Why don't the monastery leaders fix these broken bricks? How can anyone be expected to practice mindfulness when you have to constantly worry about tripping over loose stones?" As he walked, his attention was consumed by cataloging every imperfection. Here was a brick that jutted up too high. There was a gap where a brick was missing entirely. Over there was a section that had settled too low, creating a small depression that collected water after rain. His walking meditation became an exercise in frustration and judgment rather than peaceful awareness. "This is completely unacceptable," he would continue his mental complaints. "I keep stumbling over these obstacles. How can anyone find inner peace or develop concentration in these conditions? The path is a disgrace to the monastery's reputation." His companion, the second monk, walked the same path each morning in complete silence. His face maintained a calm, focused expression, and his movements flowed with grace and careful attention. He seemed to navigate the uneven terrain with ease, never appearing frustrated or disturbed by the path's condition. After several weeks of sharing this practice, the first monk's frustration finally reached a breaking point. He could no longer contain his bewilderment at his companion's apparent contentment with such obviously inadequate conditions. "How can you possibly remain so calm and peaceful?" he asked his fellow monk after they had completed their morning walk. "This path is absolutely terrible. The broken bricks make it nearly impossible to meditate properly. How do you manage to practice with such a positive attitude when the conditions are so poor?" The second monk paused thoughtfully before responding, his voice gentle and understanding. "I think I see the source of our different experiences," he said with a slight smile. You are looking at this path as an obstacle to your spiritual practice. You see the uneven bricks as interference with your meditation, as problems that prevent you from developing mindfulness and inner peace. He gestured toward the walkway they had just completed. But I see this path itself as my spiritual practice. Every loose brick serves as a perfect reminder to pay complete attention to where I am and what I'm doing in this exact moment. Every uneven surface becomes an opportunity to practice balance, both physical and mental. Every challenging step requires me to be fully present and aware. The second monk continued with growing enthusiasm for his explanation. Because of this path's condition, I am forced to be completely mindful with every single step I take. I cannot walk here carelessly or let my mind wander to other concerns. The broken bricks demand my total presence and attention. Instead of seeing obstacles, I see countless opportunities to deepen my practice moment by moment. He looked directly at his confused companion. Rather than feeling frustrated by these conditions, I have actually become grateful for them. This imperfect path has taught me more about mindfulness and present moment awareness than any smooth, easy walkway ever could. It has become my greatest teacher. As the Buddha understood, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. Here, we discover how profoundly our perception shapes our reality, transforming the same circumstances into either obstacles or opportunities. This ancient wisdom illuminates a fundamental truth about the relationship between external conditions and internal experience. The path was identical for both monks, the same loose bricks, the same uneven surfaces, the same challenging terrain. What differed completely was the frame of reference each monk brought to their encounter with these conditions. The first monk's suffering came not from the path itself, but from his resistance to the path as it was. He had a mental image of how a proper meditation path should be, smooth, level, predictable, and he measured the actual path against this ideal, finding it constantly lacking. His practice became a battle against reality rather than an engagement with what was actually present. Why do we so often expect our spiritual practice, our relationships, and our daily life to unfold under ideal conditions? We imagine that peace, growth, and happiness will come when circumstances align perfectly with our preferences. But as the second monk discovered, waiting for perfect conditions often means missing the profound teachings available in imperfect circumstances. This pattern appears throughout our lives in countless variations. We might postpone being happy until our job situation improves, our health gets better, or our relationships become easier. We delay contentment until the economy stabilizes, the weather gets nicer, or other people become more reasonable. In doing so, we miss the possibility of finding peace, growth, and even joy within current conditions, however challenging they might be. The broken bricks in the story represent all the imperfections in our daily experience that we typically see as problems rather than teachers. The difficult conversation that requires us to practice patience, the financial stress that invites us to examine our values, the physical pain that teaches us about impermanence, these challenges can become either sources of suffering or opportunities for awakening, depending on our perspective. Consider how this teaching might apply to your current challenges. Is there some area of your life where you're waiting for conditions to improve before you can be fully present and engaged? Perhaps you've been postponing contentment until your living situation changes, your health improves, or your relationships become less complicated. Zen master Suzuki Roshi said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are." and you can use a little improvement. This paradox points toward the second monk's approach, accepting conditions exactly as they are while still working skillfully within them. In our meditation practice, we often encounter the same choice between these two approaches. We might sit down to meditate and immediately notice that our mind is restless, our body is uncomfortable, or our emotions are agitated. The first monk's approach would be to see these as problems that prevent real meditation. The second monk's approach would be to use these very conditions as the substance of meditation itself. The Buddha taught, the mind is everything. What you think you become. When we think of challenges as obstacles, we become frustrated and resistant. When we think of challenges as teachers, we become curious and engaged. Tonight, as you reflect on the challenges currently present in your life, can you identify any broken bricks that you've been seeing only as obstacles to your happiness or peace? What might shift if you could approach tomorrow's difficulties with the second monk's perspective, seeing each uneven moment as an invitation to practice greater awareness and presence? As the Buddha reminded us, every morning we are born again. What we do today is what matters most. Each step on tomorrow's path offers a new opportunity to choose between resistance and engagement, between seeing problems or finding teachers. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about transforming our relationship with suffering. This is the tale of the salt and the lake. In a quiet monastery nestled among rolling hills, there lived an aging master renowned for his patience and wisdom. Among his students was a young apprentice whose heart had become heavy with complaints about life's difficulties. Each morning, the apprentice would arrive with fresh grievances. "Master, why is life so hard? Yesterday, my meditation was disturbed by noise. Today, my back aches from the hard floor. When will this suffering end?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had catalogued every small discomfort until they had grown into an overwhelming burden. The master listened with infinite patience, but as days turned to weeks, he recognized that words alone would not shift his student's perspective. One crisp morning, as golden sunlight streamed through their simple dwelling, the master made an unusual request. "My dear student," he said gently, "I need you to go to the kitchen and bring me some salt. Just a handful will suffice." The apprentice, puzzled by this simple task, nonetheless obeyed. He returned with cupped palms containing coarse white crystals. "Now," the master instructed, producing a small glass of water, "place all of that salt into this glass and drink it." The young man hesitated. "Master, that seems like far too much salt for such a small amount of water." "Trust the process," the master replied. "Drink." The apprentice poured the salt into the glass, watching the crystals dissolve into a cloudy, unappetizing mixture. He lifted it to his lips and took a large gulp, immediately grimacing as the intensely bitter taste filled his mouth. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Bitter," the apprentice spat. "Terribly, overwhelmingly bitter. I can barely stand it." The master chuckled softly. "Excellent. Now, bring that same amount of salt and come with me." Together, they walked in contemplative silence until they reached the shores of a pristine mountain lake. The water stretched before them like a mirror, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where earth ended and heaven began. "Now," the master said, "place this handful of salt into the lake." The apprentice waded into the shallow water and opened his hands, watching as the salt crystals scattered across the lake's surface, quickly dissolving without leaving any visible trace. "Drink from the lake," the master instructed. The young man cupped the lake water in his hands and brought it to his lips. The water was clean, refreshing, with the pure taste of mountain streams. "How does it taste?" the master asked. "Much fresher," the apprentice replied, genuinely surprised. "Clean and pure." "Do you taste the salt?" the master inquired gently. The student paused, paying careful attention. "No," he said slowly. "I don't taste any salt at all." The master sat beside his student on a smooth stone at the water's edge. His weathered hands reached out to clasp the young man's hands in profound tenderness. "My dear student," the master said, "the pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. The amount of pain in existence remains constant. But the amount of bitterness we experience depends entirely on the container we put that pain into." The apprentice listened with new understanding. "When you are in pain," the master continued, "the only thing you can truly control is your response. You can choose to be a small glass where every grain of salt overwhelms your senses. Or you can choose to enlarge your sense of things, to become like this vast lake where the same salt dissolves harmlessly into something much greater." The master paused. "Stop being a glass, my friend. Become a lake." The Buddha once said, "Pain is certain, suffering is optional." This fundamental teaching reveals the heart of our relationship with difficulty. We cannot eliminate the challenges woven into human existence, but we have tremendous power over how that pain affects us. What emerges from this story is understanding about consciousness itself. Our awareness is not fixed in size. It can contract into the narrow confines of a glass where every difficulty looms enormous. Or it can expand into the spaciousness of a lake where the same difficulties become manageable. Why do we often choose to be the glass rather than the lake? First is our tendency toward pain myopia, becoming so focused on discomfort that it fills our entire awareness. Second is our habit of story proliferation, taking a single painful event and creating elaborate narratives about how unfair life island. Third is the comparing mind, measuring our pain against an imaginary standard of how life should be. The lake perspective doesn't minimize genuine pain or suggest passivity. Rather, it offers a skillful way of relating to inevitable challenges that doesn't compound them with unnecessary suffering. From lake consciousness, we can respond to problems more creatively because we're not overwhelmed. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." From the lake perspective, we remember that everything arises and passes away within the vast space of awareness. Today's crisis becomes tomorrow's memory. We become a lake through practices that naturally expand awareness. Meditation teaches us to rest in spacious presence. Gratitude helps us notice experiences beyond immediate difficulties. Service reminds us that our pain is part of shared human experience. Tonight, as you reflect on current challenges, can you sense the difference between experiencing them from glass consciousness versus lake consciousness? What would it feel like to allow your awareness to expand beyond the immediate intensity of difficulties to include the vast context of this moment? As the Buddha taught, if you want to know your mind, sit down and observe it. If your mind is clear, happiness will come. The clarity he speaks of is not the absence of salt, but the spaciousness to hold it skillfully. In becoming lakes rather than glasses, we discover that pain can become a gateway to deeper compassion and freedom. Now, let us explore a story about the difference between superficial understanding and lived wisdom. This is the tale of following the stream. In the heart of a vast wilderness, where towering pines stretched toward endless sky, two city dwellers found themselves completely lost. They had ventured into the high timber for what was supposed to be a simple day hike, but overconfidence and poor preparation had led them far from any familiar trail. For a day and a night, they wandered through the dense forest, their anxiety growing with each passing hour. The comfortable urban world they knew seemed impossibly distant. Every tree looked the same, every path led to another confusing intersection, and their sense of direction had completely abandoned them. Just as panic was beginning to set in, they stumbled upon an old hermit sitting peacefully beside a small clearing. His weathered face spoke of years spent in solitude, and his calm presence offered immediate comfort to the desperate travelers. "How do we find our way back to civilization?" they asked urgently, their voices carrying the desperation of people who had exhausted their own resources. The hermit looked at them with kind eyes that seemed to see more than their immediate predicament. "I could tell you," he replied thoughtfully, "but you'd still get lost." The two men exchanged confused glances. This wasn't the straightforward directions they had hoped for. "What should we do?" they asked, their frustration evident. "Go with the flow," the hermit answered simply. "I beg your pardon?" One of them responded, clearly expecting something more practical and specific. The hermit smiled and gestured toward a small stream that bubbled cheerfully through the clearing. "Go with the flow. You see that stream over there? Just follow it. Streams go into creeks, and creeks go into rivers, and rivers go through towns. Also, along the way you'll have water to drink and berries to eat." This practical advice made immediate sense to the lost travelers. Following water downstream was indeed a reliable way to find human settlements, and the stream would provide essential resources they needed for survival during their journey. But one of the men, perhaps having heard spiritual teachings before, asked a deeper question. "Is that what Zen people mean when they say, 'go with the flow'?" The hermit paused for a moment, considering this question with the same careful attention he had given their practical need for directions. "Yes and no," he replied enigmatically, and then continued along his way, leaving the two men to find their own understanding of his words. The Buddha once said, "If you understand, things are just as they are. If you do not understand, things are just as they are." This teaching points to the layered nature of wisdom that the hermit embodied in his response to the lost travelers. The deeper teaching here shows us how authentic spiritual guidance operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The hermit's advice was both completely practical and profoundly metaphorical. On the surface level, following the stream was simply good wilderness survival strategy. On a deeper level, it represented the entire approach to living that Zen encourages. Why did the hermit say the travelers would still get lost, even if he gave them directions? This points to a fundamental truth about the difference between receiving information and developing wisdom. External directions can guide us temporarily, but they don't develop our inner capacity for navigation. Real wisdom involves learning to read the natural signs and flow with the underlying currents of life itself. Consider how this applies to our spiritual seeking. We often approach teachers and teachings looking for specific directions. Tell me exactly what to do to become enlightened. Give me the precise meditation technique that will solve my problems. But this approach, while understandable, misses the deeper point. True spiritual guidance doesn't provide a map, but teaches us how to read the territory. It doesn't give us someone else's answers, but helps us develop the capacity to find our own. Like the stream that naturally knows its way to the ocean, we each have an innate wisdom that can guide us if we learn to trust and follow it. The phrase, "go with the flow," has become so common in popular culture that it's almost lost its meaning, often interpreted as passive resignation or lack of direction. But the hermit's yes and no response points to a more nuanced understanding. True flowing isn't about drifting aimlessly, but about aligning our efforts with the natural currents of wisdom and compassion. The stream represents the Tao, the natural way that underlies all existence. When we align ourselves with this deeper flow, our actions become effortless and effective. We stop pushing against reality and learn to work with the grain of existence rather than against it. But this requires developing a different kind of intelligence than our usual problem-solving mind. The travelers wanted explicit directions because that's how the rational mind works, through clear, step-by-step instructions. But the deeper intelligence the hermit was pointing toward operates more like intuition, sensing the right direction moment by moment rather than following a predetermined plan. This is why contemplative traditions emphasize present moment awareness. The stream doesn't need to know where the ocean is, it simply flows in the direction that feels natural right now. Similarly, when we develop moment-to-moment mindfulness, we can sense the appropriate response to each situation without needing to figure out the entire journey in advance. Tonight, as you navigate the complexities of your own life, can you sense the streams of natural wisdom flowing beneath the surface of your daily concerns? What would it mean to trust that deeper current while still attending responsibly to practical necessities? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, thousands of candles can be lighted from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. The hermit's guidance was like lighting a candle in the travelers' minds, providing not just directions but a way of approaching life that could serve them in countless future situations. Let us now turn to a story about the fundamental truth that governs all experience. This is the teaching of the meditation student and the wise reminder. A young student had been practicing meditation for several months with sincere dedication. Each morning and evening, he would sit quietly on his cushion, close his eyes, and attempt to follow the breathing techniques his teacher had shown him. Some days the practice felt natural and peaceful, but recently he had been struggling with what seemed like constant distraction and discomfort. On this particular morning, he could barely sit still for 5 minutes before frustration overwhelmed him. His mind raced with thoughts about work, relationships, and a dozen trivial concerns. His legs ached from sitting in an unfamiliar position, and despite his best efforts to focus on his breath, he found himself constantly pulled away by mental chatter and physical restlessness. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, he gave up on his practice and sought out his meditation teacher. He found the elderly monk tending a small garden behind the meditation hall, peacefully pulling weeds in the early morning sunlight. "Teacher," the student said, his voice heavy with discouragement and self-criticism, "my meditation is horrible. I can't focus on anything. I feel so distracted and scattered. My legs ache constantly, and I keep falling asleep when I'm not distracted. Everything about my practice feels wrong. It's just horrible." The teacher looked up from his gardening, soil still clinging to his weathered hands, and met the student's frustrated gaze with calm, knowing eyes. He listened to the young man's litany of complaints without judgment or surprise, as if he had heard these exact same words countless times before. "It will pass," the teacher said matter-of-factly, then returned to his weeding as if nothing unusual had occurred. The student stood there for a moment, somewhat taken aback by the brevity and seeming dismissiveness of the response. He had expected detailed advice, perhaps some new technique, or at least some reassurance about his difficulties. Instead, he received just 3 simple words. Feeling somewhat unsatisfied but having nothing more to say, he returned to his room to contemplate this cryptic guidance. Over the following days, the student continued his practice despite his frustrations. Gradually, something began to shift. The intense distractions started to subside, his body adjusted to the sitting position, and moments of genuine peace began to emerge between the chaos of thoughts. By the end of the week, his meditation had transformed completely. Excited by this positive change, he once again sought out his teacher, this time finding him sweeping leaves from the temple courtyard. The student's face glowed with enthusiasm and relief. "Teacher," he exclaimed, "my meditation is wonderful now. I feel so aware, so peaceful, so alive during my practice. My mind is clear, my body is comfortable, and I'm experiencing the most beautiful states of consciousness. Everything about my meditation is just wonderful." The teacher paused in his sweeping, looked at the student with the same calm expression he had worn the week before, and gave exactly the same response. "It will pass." This time the student heard the deeper teaching. His excitement about his wonderful meditation began to transform into something subtler, not disappointment, but understanding. He realized that his teacher was pointing to something fundamental about the nature of all experience, not just meditation. Buddha's wisdom tells us, "This too shall pass." The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the impermanent nature of all phenomena, both pleasant and unpleasant, both the experiences we cling to and those we try to escape. Why do we struggle so intensely with the changing nature of our experience? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes from our resistance to impermanence, our desperate attempts to hold on to pleasant states, and our equally desperate attempts to escape unpleasant ones. We exhaust ourselves trying to control what is essentially uncontrollable. The student's meditation experiences, both horrible and wonderful, were equally temporary. His teacher's consistent response pointed to a deeper stability that exists beneath the constantly changing surface of experience. This isn't the stability of unchanging conditions, but the stability of awareness itself, the space in which all changing experiences arise and pass away. Consider your own relationship with the ups and downs of daily life. How much energy do you spend trying to perpetuate good moods, successful periods, or comfortable circumstances? How much resistance do you feel toward difficult emotions, challenging phases, or uncomfortable situations? Both the grasping and the resistance create unnecessary suffering. In Zen practice, we learn to develop what might be called equanimity with impermanence. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to our experiences or not caring about outcomes. Rather, it means developing the capacity to remain centered and responsive regardless of whether current circumstances are pleasant or unpleasant. The teacher's repeated phrase, "It will pass," contains both comfort and challenge. It offers comfort during difficult times by reminding us that no painful state lasts forever. It challenges us during pleasant times by preventing us from building our identity around temporary successes or peak experiences. Zen master Suzuki Roshi taught, Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement. This paradox points to the same truth the meditation teacher was sharing. We can fully appreciate and engage with our current experience while simultaneously holding it lightly, knowing it will inevitably change. Look deeply at your own patterns of attachment and aversion. Where in your life are you trying to make permanent what is naturally temporary? Where are you exhausting yourself fighting against conditions that will shift on their own if you simply allow them to run their natural course? The Buddha said, "All conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence." This teaching invites us to pour ourselves wholeheartedly into life while simultaneously holding all outcomes lightly. We can care deeply about our practice, our relationships, our work, and our growth, while remembering that all forms and experiences are temporary visitors in the space of awareness. This understanding transforms how we relate to both success and failure, both pleasure and pain. Instead of being thrown around by the inevitable fluctuations of life, we can find our stability in the awareness that remains constant while everything else changes. Tonight, as you notice whatever states of mind and body are present, whether comfortable or uncomfortable, pleasant or unpleasant, clear or confused, can you remember the meditation teacher's simple wisdom? Can you hold your current experience fully while simultaneously knowing that it, like everything else, will pass? As the Buddha observed, just as the great ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so also this teaching has one taste, the taste of liberation. The taste of liberation is found not in achieving permanent, pleasant states, but in discovering the freedom that comes from dancing gracefully with the ever-changing nature of existence itself. Now, let us explore a story about the patient path to wisdom and the paradox of urgent seeking. This is the teaching of the one-eyed student. In a peaceful valley surrounded by cherry trees, a young man had heard stories of a renowned Zen master whose students achieved profound realization through diligent practice. Filled with spiritual ambition and eager to transform his life, the young seeker traveled many days to reach the master's monastery, his mind burning with determination to attain enlightenment as quickly as possible. When he finally arrived, dusty from the road and bright with enthusiasm, he immediately sought an audience with the master. The old teacher received him in a simple room overlooking a garden where monks moved slowly among vegetables and flowers, their movements unhurried and graceful. "Master," the young man said, bowing earnestly, "I have come to study Zen with complete dedication. I am willing to work harder than anyone has ever worked before. Tell me, if I apply myself with absolute diligence and unwavering effort, how long will it take for me to find Zen?" The master sat quietly for a long moment, watching the young man's eager face, noting the tension in his shoulders and the urgent energy that radiated from his posture. Finally, he replied thoughtfully, 10 years. The student's eyes widened with surprise. 10 years seemed like such a long time when enlightenment felt so urgent, so necessary for his happiness. Surely, with the right approach, the process could be accelerated. "But Master," he said, leaning forward intently, "what if I work very, very hard and really apply myself to learn fast? What if I meditate longer than the other students, study more texts, practice more intensively? How long then?" The master considered this with the same careful attention, then replied calmly, "Well, 20 years. The young man's face showed his confusion and growing frustration. This made no sense at all. How could greater effort result in slower progress? Perhaps the master hadn't understood the depth of his commitment. "But master, I don't think you understand how serious I am about this," he said, his voice rising slightly with urgency. "What if I really work at it? What if I dedicate every waking moment to practice, sleep only when absolutely necessary, and push myself beyond all normal limits? Surely then I could achieve realization much faster. How long would it take then?" 30 years, the master replied without hesitation. By now, the student was completely bewildered and increasingly agitated. Nothing the master said made sense according to his understanding of how learning worked. In every other area of life, music, martial arts, scholarship, harder work produced faster results. Why should spiritual practice be different? "Master, I do not understand," he said, no longer able to hide his disappointment and confusion. "Each time that I say I will work harder, you say it will take me longer. This seems completely backwards. Why do you say that?" The master's expression became gentle and compassionate, like a father explaining something important to a beloved child who was old enough to understand. "When you have one eye on the goal, you only have one eye on the path," the master explained quietly. Ancient Buddhist wisdom tells us, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. What emerges from this story is a profound teaching about the nature of spiritual progress and the paradox of goal-oriented seeking. Why does intense goal fixation actually slow our spiritual development? Zen Buddhism reveals several ways that excessive focus on attainment creates obstacles to realization. First is the problem of divided attention. When part of our consciousness is constantly measuring progress toward an imagined destination, we cannot fully inhabit the present moment practices that actually cultivate awakening. Consider learning to play a musical instrument. If you spend half your practice time obsessing about when you'll be good enough to perform publicly, that energy isn't available for the careful attention to finger placement, rhythm, and tone that develops skill. The music emerges through complete absorption in the present moment relationship between musician and instrument, not through anxious projection toward future competence. Second is what Zen calls gaining mind, the subtle grasping that turns spiritual practice into a transaction. When we practice meditation to get enlightenment, study texts to accumulate wisdom, or cultivate compassion to become better people, we're approaching the path as consumers rather than participants. This gaining mind creates a fundamental split between who we think we are now and who we imagine we need to become. The Buddha said, "What you are looking for is where you are looking from." This profound teaching points to the very heart of the Master's lesson. Zen is not something we attain, but something we recognize. It's not a destination we reach, but the very awareness with which we walk the path. This ancient wisdom illuminates why urgent spiritual seeking often becomes self-defeating. When we're frantically pursuing enlightenment, we're operating from the assumption that our present experience is somehow inadequate or incomplete. But Zen teaches that the seeking mind itself is the very awareness we're seeking to find. Look deeply at your own experience of learning and growth. Haven't your most profound insights often come when you weren't actively trying to have insights? Perhaps while walking in nature, washing dishes, or simply sitting quietly without agenda. These moments of natural awareness reveal what the Master was pointing toward, that wisdom emerges when we stop dividing our attention between here and there, now and then. Zen Master Huang Po taught, "Your everyday mind, that is the way." This teaching invites us to examine our relationship to spiritual practice itself. Are we practicing to become someone different, or are we practicing to recognize who we already are? Are we walking the path to get somewhere else, or are we discovering that the path itself is the destination? The student's error wasn't his desire for realization, but his assumption that it existed somewhere other than in his present moment experience. Each time he proposed working harder, he was actually moving further from the natural awareness that practice reveals. Like trying to catch your own shadow by running faster, the more urgently you chase it, the more it seems to flee. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called just sitting, meditation without gaining mind, without agenda, without dividing attention between practice and goal. This doesn't mean we become passive or lose our dedication. Instead, we bring wholehearted attention to each moment of practice, allowing insights to emerge naturally rather than forcing them through willful effort. Consider how this teaching might apply to other areas of your life. Perhaps in relationships, where trying too hard to be loved often pushes others away. Or in creative work, where forcing inspiration typically produces stilted results while relaxed attention allows natural creativity to flow. Tonight, as you notice your mind racing toward imagined destinations, the person you want to become, the peace you want to find, the understanding you want to achieve, can you remember the Master's teaching? Can you gently return both eyes to the path, discovering that the journey itself contains everything you thought you were seeking at its end? Buddha spoke of this when he said, "There is no way to happiness. Happiness is the way." By walking the path with undivided attention, we discover that what we thought lay at its end was present in every step. As we continue our journey, let us now turn to a story about acceptance and the art of contentment. This is the shepherd's wisdom. Along a dusty mountain road where wildflowers dotted the hillsides, a weary traveler encountered a shepherd tending his flock. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, and clouds gathered on the horizon, creating an uncertain sky that could promise either gentle rain or scorching heat. The shepherd sat peacefully on a smooth boulder, watching his sheep graze contentedly among wild grasses. His face bore the calm expression of one who had spent countless seasons under open sky, learning lessons that only nature can teach. There was something in his demeanor, a quality of unshakable serenity that drew the traveler's attention. "Good morning, friend," the traveler called out, wiping sweat from his brow. "What kind of weather are we going to have today?" The shepherd looked up with eyes that held mountain stream clarity and smiled with genuine warmth. "The kind of weather I like," he replied simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. The traveler paused, confused. He had expected a practical forecast that would help him plan his day. Instead, he received what seemed like circular logic, offering no useful information. "How do you know it will be the kind of weather you like?" The traveler pressed, his voice carrying frustration mixed with curiosity. The shepherd's smile deepened, and he gestured toward the vast sky above them, where clouds and clear patches moved in their eternal dance. "Having found out, sir, that I cannot always get what I like," he said with the patience of one who had learned life's most essential lesson, "I have learned to always like what I get. So, I am quite sure we will have the kind of weather I like." The traveler stood in silence, the profound simplicity of this wisdom settling into his understanding like seeds finding fertile ground. Here was a man who had discovered something that all the weather predictions in the world could not provide: complete freedom from the anxiety of uncertainty. As the Buddha observed, attachment is the root of suffering. What emerges from this story is the recognition that true contentment comes not from controlling external circumstances, but from transforming our relationship to whatever circumstances arise. Why do we exhaust ourselves trying to arrange life according to our preferences rather than learning to find peace within whatever life presents? The shepherd represents what Zen calls great acceptance, not passive resignation, but the profound wisdom that recognizes resistance to reality as the primary source of suffering. When we fight against what is, we create an internal war that drains our energy and blocks our capacity for contentment. When we learn to align ourselves with reality as it unfolds, we discover the tremendous peace that comes from swimming with the current rather than against it. Consider how much mental and emotional energy we spend each day resisting circumstances beyond our control. Traffic jams, weather that doesn't match our plans, people who don't behave as we think they should. Each resistance creates a small contraction in our awareness, a tiny rebellion against reality that accumulates into chronic dissatisfaction. The shepherd's approach doesn't mean becoming passive or ceasing to have preferences. We can still hope for sunny days while fully accepting rainy ones. We can work toward goals while finding peace when outcomes differ from expectations. The key lies in holding our preferences lightly, rather than allowing them to determine our contentment. Zen master Sung Tan wrote, "The great way is not difficult for those who have no preferences." This doesn't suggest eliminating all desires, but rather not allowing those desires to become demands that reality must fulfill for us to be okay. Look deeply at your own patterns of resistance. How often do you find yourself arguing with reality, wishing circumstances were different, or believing you'll be content when things change? This tension is optional, not because you should suppress your desires, but because you can learn to hold them more skillfully. The Buddha taught that attachment doesn't mean caring deeply about things. It means making our inner peace conditional on external circumstances arranging themselves according to our specifications. The shepherd cares about his flock and appreciates comfort, but his fundamental contentment doesn't depend on any particular outcome. Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, both pleasant and challenging, can you find the shepherd's secret within your own awareness? What if contentment isn't waiting for better circumstances, but is available right now through a shift in perspective? As the Buddha taught, happiness does not depend on what you have or who you are. It solely relies on what you think. The shepherd discovered that when we stop demanding that life conform to our expectations, we find the freedom to enjoy life exactly as it presents itself. Our next story speaks to the moment when understanding transcends effort. This is no water, no moon. The nun Chiono had devoted many years to intensive Zen study and practice. She spent countless hours in meditation, wrestling with profound koans and contemplating the deepest teachings of the Buddha. Her dedication was unwavering. She rose before dawn each day, sat in perfect posture through pain and discomfort, and approached her spiritual practice with the kind of fierce determination that impressed even her teachers. Despite her sincere efforts and obvious commitment, enlightenment continued to elude her. She could understand the concepts intellectually, speak eloquently about emptiness and non-duality, and even guide other students through basic meditation techniques. But the final breakthrough, the direct realization that would transform her understanding completely, remained just beyond her grasp. Years passed this way. Chiono began to feel a growing frustration with her practice. She watched as other students seemed to achieve insights that remained mysterious to her. She questioned her methods, intensified her efforts, and sometimes wondered if she lacked some essential capacity for awakening that others possessed naturally. One night, after a particularly long day of meditation and study, Chiono was walking slowly back to her small quarters. She carried an old wooden water pail that she had filled at the well earlier that evening. The pail was ancient, held together by strips of bamboo that had grown worn and weak with age. It had served faithfully for many years, but she could feel it becoming increasingly fragile in her hands. As she walked through the moonlit courtyard, she became mesmerized by the sight before her. The full moon hung perfectly in the dark sky above, its bright light illuminating the temple grounds with a soft, ethereal glow. But what captured her attention was the reflection of that moon in the water she carried. There, contained within her humble pail, was a perfect, unbroken circle of light. The moon itself, complete and radiant, held in water. She walked carefully, almost reverently, watching this reflected moon dance gently with each step she took. The image was so clear, so perfect, that it seemed as real as the moon in the sky above. For a moment, she felt she was carrying something sacred, transporting this luminous presence from the well to her room. Suddenly, without warning, the aged bamboo strips that held the pail together finally gave way. The bottom of the bucket fell out completely, and all the water rushed to the ground in a single, swift motion. In an instant, the reflection of the moon vanished completely. With no water, there was no moon. At that precise moment, watching the reflected moon disappear as the water hit the earth, Chiono experienced complete liberation. All her years of seeking, striving, and effort suddenly revealed themselves as unnecessary. The very thing she had been chasing, enlightenment, awakening, understanding, had never been separate from her to begin with. Like the moon's reflection, it had appeared to exist independently, but it was simply the natural expression of what was already present. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Look within. You are the Buddha." The deeper teaching here shows us that spiritual realization often comes not through accumulation, but through release, not through grasping, but through letting go. This ancient tale illuminates a fundamental paradox in all spiritual seeking. We begin the path believing that enlightenment is something we must acquire, achieve, or attain through effort and discipline. We imagine it as a distant goal, a state of consciousness we don't currently possess, but might earn through sufficient practice and dedication. Chiono's years of sincere effort weren't wasted. They were necessary preparation, like tenderizing the soil before planting seeds. But her breakthrough came precisely when she stopped trying to capture and hold on to spiritual realization and instead witnessed its natural arising and dissolving. Why do we find it so difficult to recognize what is already present? The seeking mind creates the very separation it hopes to overcome. When we believe that awakening exists out there or in the future, we overlook the awareness that is reading these words right now, the consciousness that experiences thoughts and emotions without being limited by them. Consider how this pattern plays out in your own spiritual life or personal development. Do you sometimes feel like you're chasing insights, trying to grasp peace, or working to achieve a state of mind that seems just beyond reach? The very effort to capture these experiences can prevent us from recognizing that the awareness capable of seeking is already what we're seeking. This doesn't mean abandoning all spiritual practice or personal growth efforts. Chiono's years of discipline created the conditions for her realization. but it does point toward a different relationship with practice, engaging wholeheartedly while holding the results lightly, like carrying water that might spill at any moment. Zen master Bankei expressed this understanding when he said, "The unborn is the Buddha, mind itself." When you have realized this fact, the Buddha mind with which you were born from your mother has done the Buddha's work from the very beginning. What we're seeking in meditation, therapy, or personal growth is the recognition of what was never absent. The water and moon in the story represent the apparent duality between seeker and sought, between the ordinary mind and the awakened mind. As long as we believe these are separate, that the moon exists independently in the water, we try to protect and preserve our spiritual experiences. But when the container breaks, we discover that the separation was illusory. This teaching extends beyond formal spiritual practice into every area of life where we chase happiness, success, or fulfillment, as if these were objects to be acquired rather than expressions of our true nature. The perfect relationship, the ideal job, the peaceful state of mind, these are often reflections we try to capture and hold, not recognizing that their essence is already present in our capacity to appreciate and seek them. In Zen practice, we learn to trust the process of natural unfolding rather than forcing insights or demanding particular experiences. Sometimes the most profound understanding comes when we stop trying so hard to understand, when we let the bottom fall out of our containers and allow our carefully constructed spiritual images to dissolve. The Buddha taught, "The one who has conquered himself is a far greater hero than he who has defeated 1,000 times 1,000 men." The conquest Kyono achieved was not victory over ignorance, but recognition that the battle itself was based on a misunderstanding. Tonight, as you reflect on your own seeking and striving, can you imagine what it might feel like to let the bottom fall out of your spiritual container? What would happen if you stopped trying to capture and hold on to your insights and instead trusted the natural wisdom that already animates your seeking? As the Buddha reminded us, within you there is a stillness and a sanctuary to which you can retreat at any time and be yourself. Perhaps what we're looking for has been looking through our eyes all along. Let us now explore a story about the invisible burdens we carry through life. This is the tale of the empty backpack. In a serene monastery garden, where morning dew glistened on carefully tended paths, a young seeker approached his teacher with a question weighing heavily on his heart. His eyes reflected both determination and confusion as he bowed respectfully. "Master," he said, "I wish to understand my path on earth better. Why do I seem to carry my past and relive it again and again? Why can't I get past my past?" The master studied the young man with compassionate eyes, then gestured toward an intricate maze of translucent silk panels shimmering in the garden's filtered sunlight. "Go forward into the maze," he said, reaching for a leather backpack. "But carry this as you walk. It will help you stay focused. Be careful though, as it is quite heavy." The young man accepted the backpack, initially surprised by how easily the master handed it over. But the moment it settled into his grasp, he gasped. The weight was extraordinary, forcing him to bend forward as he struggled toward the maze. Inside the silken labyrinth, he immediately encountered solid walls. Through the translucent material, he could see other seekers navigating their paths like distant ghosts. No matter which direction he turned, every path seemed blocked. Exhausted, he sat down to think. "Others are clearly ahead of me," he thought. "Should I cheat and crawl under the silk?" After wrestling with these thoughts, he chose integrity. As he stood with renewed resolve, an opening magically appeared. Progress felt rewarding until he faced another wall. This time, good intentions yielded no results. The backpack's weight became unbearable, cutting into his shoulders. What could be so heavy yet feel so soft? Overcome with curiosity, he removed the pack and peered inside. It was completely empty. Yet when he lifted it again, the weight remained undeniable. As he placed it back on his shoulders, a voice whispered clearly, "Look inside of you, young man, for the weight lies there." Suddenly, memories flooded his consciousness. His childhood tormentors, accumulated hurts and resentments carried for years. As he relived each painful experience, the backpack grew heavier. Then understanding dawned, "I am the weight. I carry the burden of that which troubles me." With this insight, he began the work of forgiveness. "I forgive you wherever you are," he found himself saying. Immediately, the pack lightened and new pathways opened. As sunlight warmed his face and he remembered moments of love, the weight continued diminishing until the backpack felt weightless. Finally, surrounded by solid silk walls, he sat in meditation. "I am the light and the way." I recognized that I was the impediment, not anyone else. At these words, his feet began rising from the earth. He floated above the maze, seeing how others remained trapped by darkness in their own packs. With a thought, he found himself beside his teacher outside the labyrinth. "Master," he said, his face radiant, "I discovered that my darkness caused my weight, and my lightness freed me to fly." The master smiled knowingly. "What do you feel, young one? Do you feel freed?" Without waiting for an answer, he walked away. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This ancient teaching illuminates the profound truth revealed in the empty backpack story. We are the creators of our own burdens. What emerges from this tale is recognition that our past does not imprison us, our relationship to our past does. The young seeker discovered that suffering came not from what others had done, but from his unwillingness to release those experiences. The empty backpack represents the invisible weight of unprocessed emotions and unhealed wounds we carry through life. Why do we cling so tenaciously to our pain? First is our identification with wounds. We derive identity from grievances, thinking, "I am someone who was wronged," rather than, "I experienced wronging, but am not defined by it." Second is our addiction to the familiar. Even painful emotions become comfortable because they're known. Third is our misunderstanding of forgiveness, believing it means condoning harmful behavior rather than freeing ourselves from resentment's prison. Consider how this plays out daily. The colleague who received credit for your idea still triggers anger. The parent who criticized you decades ago still influences your self-talk. Each is an invisible item in your backpack, weighing you down. Zen teacher Jack Cornfield taught, "Forgiveness is giving up all hope of having had a different past." We cannot change what happened, but we can change our relationship to what happened. The energy spent maintaining grievances could be redirected toward creating the life we actually want. The floating represents lightness available when we release psychological burdens. This isn't about bypassing pain, but processing experiences fully and choosing freedom over familiarity, growth over grievance. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, What invisible weight might you be carrying? Perhaps it's time to examine what you've been holding on to and ask, does this serve my highest good, or is it time to set it down? As the Buddha taught, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. The path to freedom begins with radical self, forgiveness and willingness to travel light through life's inevitable challenges. Now, let us explore a story about the weight of our thoughts. This is the stone mind. Master Hogan was walking peacefully through the monastery garden with one of his most earnest students on a warm afternoon. The garden was a place of contemplation, carefully designed with winding paths that led past ancient trees, small ponds, and carefully arranged rocks that had been placed by previous generations of monks to inspire reflection and meditation. As they strolled along one of the main pathways, the student's attention was drawn to a particularly large boulder that sat prominently near the center of the garden. This stone was massive, perhaps the size of a small building, and had been there for so many years that moss had grown across its surface and small plants had taken root in its crevices. It was clearly a permanent and substantial feature of the monastery grounds. The student had been studying Buddhist philosophy intensively and was eager to demonstrate his understanding of the teachings he had been learning. He saw in this prominent stone an opportunity to engage his master in a philosophical discussion that would reveal his grasp of complex metaphysical concepts. Pointing directly at the large rock, the student posed what he believed was a sophisticated question that would invite profound dialogue about the nature of reality and consciousness. "Master," the student said with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about abstract spiritual matters, "the sutras teach us that all phenomena ultimately exist within consciousness, that everything we perceive is, in the deepest sense, a manifestation of mind itself. Given this fundamental teaching about the nature of reality, would you say that this large stone is inside my mind, or would you say it exists outside of my mind as a separate object?" The student stood there expectantly, clearly proud of his question and anticipating a lengthy philosophical discourse about the relationship between consciousness and material reality. He had framed his inquiry in terms of classical Buddhist metaphysics, touching on some of the most sophisticated concepts in the tradition regarding the nature of perception and the ultimate ground of existence. Master Hogan paused for a moment, looking at his student with the calm, penetrating gaze that characterized his teaching style. He considered the question carefully, not dismissing it, but recognizing immediately the mental trap his student had created for himself through excessive intellectualization. Rather than launching into the kind of abstract philosophical explanation the student was expecting, Master Hogan responded with perfect simplicity and directness. "You must have a very heavy mind," he replied gently, "to be carrying a stone like that around in it." The student stood there speechless, his elaborate philosophical framework suddenly revealed as unnecessarily complex. In a single sentence, his master had pointed directly to the absurdity of his mental construction, while simultaneously teaching him something profound about the nature of thought itself. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. What emerges from this story is a teaching about how our thinking mind can create burdens that have no basis in actual reality. The deeper lesson here illuminates how intellectual analysis, while valuable in appropriate contexts, can become a form of mental carrying that weighs us down unnecessarily. The student had taken a simple, direct experience, encountering a stone in a garden, and transformed it into a philosophical problem that required mental effort to resolve. Hogan's response reveals the absurdity of this entire mental process. The stone wasn't actually in the student's mind in any literal sense, nor did the student need to figure out its ontological status to encounter it appropriately. By pointing to the heaviness of carrying such concepts around mentally, the master highlighted how much unnecessary labor we create for ourselves through excessive thinking. Why do we tend to complicate direct experience with elaborate mental frameworks? The thinking mind offers us a sense of understanding and control. When we can categorize, analyze, and explain our experiences, we feel that we're gaining mastery over reality. But as this story reveals, sometimes our explanations become more burdensome than the original experiences they were meant to clarify. This pattern appears constantly in our daily lives. We might encounter a simple emotion like sadness and immediately begin analyzing its causes, constructing narratives about what it means, and developing strategies for managing it. What began as a straightforward feeling becomes a heavy psychological project that we carry around in our minds. Or we might have a disagreement with a friend and transform it into an elaborate mental case study involving personality analysis, relationship dynamics, and complex theories about human behavior. The simple task of addressing a misunderstanding becomes weighed down with conceptual baggage that makes resolution more difficult rather than easier. In spiritual practice, this tendency toward mental heaviness shows up as what might be called dharma collecting, accumulating insights, techniques, and understandings that become burdens rather than liberations. We might study meditation for years while creating an increasingly complex internal library of spiritual concepts that we carry around rather than simply sitting quietly and breathing. Zen Master Yunmen said, "Every day is a good day." This points toward the possibility of meeting each moment directly without the mental weight of excessive interpretation or analysis. The stone in the garden was simply a stone, an object to be appreciated, perhaps sat upon, or simply noticed and passed by. It didn't require philosophical categorization to be encountered appropriately. Hogan's teaching method was particularly skillful because he didn't dismiss his student's question as wrong or inappropriate. Instead, he pointed to the practical consequence of thinking in such abstract terms, the heaviness it creates in our mental experience. By using the metaphor of carrying physical weight, he made the burden of excessive thinking tangible and obvious. This teaching doesn't advocate for abandoning all thinking or philosophical inquiry. Intellectual understanding has its place and value, but it does point toward distinguishing between useful thinking that serves practical purposes and mental elaboration that creates unnecessary complexity and burden. Sometimes, the most profound spiritual insight is recognizing that we don't need to understand everything intellectually. We can encounter a beautiful sunset without analyzing the physics of light refraction. We can feel love for someone without constructing elaborate theories about the nature of human connection. We can sit in meditation without carrying around complex ideas about enlightenment. The Buddha taught simplicity, patience, compassion. These three are your greatest treasures. Hogan was pointing his student toward the treasure of simplicity, the relief that comes from setting down mental weights we never needed to pick up in the first place. Tonight, as you prepare for rest, notice if you're carrying any stones around in your mind, complex worries about future scenarios, elaborate interpretations of past events, or sophisticated analyses of your current circumstances. What would it feel like to simply set these mental burdens down, even temporarily? As the Buddha reminded us, peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. Sometimes the deepest peace comes not from finding better thoughts to think, but from recognizing that we don't need to carry so many thoughts at all. Let us keep going on our journey. The following story reveals the difference between helping and holding on. This is the lesson of the two monks and the woman at the river. Two monks were traveling together along a mountain path, making their way to a distant monastery where they planned to continue their studies. Both were dedicated practitioners who had taken strict vows as part of their spiritual training, including a vow to avoid all physical contact with women. This wasn't born from disrespect, but from their understanding that such discipline helped maintain focus on their spiritual development. As they approached a swollen river where the usual bridge had been damaged by recent storms, they encountered a young woman standing uncertainly at the water's edge. The current was strong and treacherous, filled with debris from the mountain runoff, and she was clearly afraid to attempt crossing alone. "Please, honored monks," she called to them, "could one of you help me cross this dangerous water? I'm not strong enough to make it safely on my own." One of the monks immediately tensed, his mind racing through their monastic rules and the potential complications of this situation. Physical contact with women was explicitly forbidden, and he began formulating explanations for why they couldn't help, perhaps suggestions for alternative solutions that wouldn't require breaking their vows. The other monk, however, took one look at the woman's predicament and the genuine danger she faced and made a different choice. Without hesitation or lengthy deliberation, he walked to her side and gently lifted her onto his shoulders. He carried her carefully across the treacherous current, ensuring her safety with each step, and set her down gently on the far bank. "Thank you so much," she said gratefully, bowing to both monks before continuing on her way. The two monks resumed their journey, but the atmosphere between them had changed dramatically. The first monk walked in increasingly agitated silence, his mind churning with thoughts about what he had witnessed. As the hours passed, his internal tension grew until finally he could no longer contain his distress. "Brother," he burst out, unable to hold his silence any longer, "I cannot understand your behavior back at the river. Our spiritual training explicitly teaches us to avoid any physical contact with women, yet you picked that woman up onto your shoulders and carried her across the water. How could you so blatantly violate our sacred vows?" His companion looked at him with gentle surprise and responded with perfect simplicity. "Brother, I set her down on the other side of the river hours ago, but you are still carrying her." Buddha's wisdom teaches us, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. This tale unveils the profound difference between compassionate action and mental attachment, between responding to present needs and carrying past events. Why do we often carry situations long after they've ended, replaying scenarios and nursing grievances that only exist in our own minds? Zen Buddhism reveals that much of our suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our inability to release experiences once they've passed. The first monk's agitation demonstrates how rigid adherence to rules can sometimes conflict with the compassionate spirit that inspired those rules originally. His fellow monk saw a person in danger and responded with immediate kindness, then completely released the incident. But the first monk carried the event for hours, letting it grow heavier with each step. Consider your own tendency to replay past conversations, nurse old grievances, or mentally rehearse scenarios that have already ended. How much of your mental energy goes toward carrying situations that exist now only in memory? The woman crossed the river in minutes, but the monk carried her for hours through his own thoughts. This teaching applies to far more than dramatic violations of rules. We carry harsh words someone spoke years ago, mistakes we made decades past, embarrassing moments that no one else even remembers. Meanwhile, the present moment, rich with possibility and actual experience, goes unnoticed because we're too busy carrying ghosts from the past. In Zen practice, we learn to distinguish between appropriate action and unnecessary attachment. The second monk helped when help was needed, then moved on completely. He didn't dwell on whether he'd made the right choice, worry about others' opinions, or replay the incident endlessly in his mind. Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The river crossing was impermanent, it began, served its purpose, and ended. Only the first monk's attachment to the event gave it ongoing existence in the form of mental suffering. The Buddha said, "Let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Don't try to figure anything out. Don't try to make anything happen. Relax right now and rest." This teaching points directly to the freedom available when we stop carrying experiences beyond their natural lifespan. Look deeply at what you might be carrying unnecessarily. Old resentments, past failures, conversations that upset you, decisions you regret, all of these exist now only because you continue to pick them up and carry them. What would it feel like to set them down? The irony is profound. The monk who actually broke the rule experienced no suffering from it, while the monk who maintained perfect rule, observance created hours of agitation for himself. This reveals that suffering often comes not from our actions, but from our thoughts about our actions. Tonight, as you notice your mind returning to past events, old grievances, or situations that have already ended, can you remember the wise monk's example? Can you practice setting down whatever you've been carrying unnecessarily, discovering the lightness that comes from traveling through life without the burden of yesterday's experiences? As Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, only three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. True spiritual practice isn't about perfect rule following, but about responding appropriately to what's actually present, then releasing it completely to make space for whatever comes next. Let us now turn to a tale about the nature of faith and self-doubt. This is the story of the wishing tree. A poor man walked slowly through a dense forest, his shoulders heavy with worry. Bills unpaid, relationships strained, dreams deferred, each step seemed to echo with the weight of his many troubles. The canopy above filtered the sunlight into gentle patterns on the forest floor, but he noticed none of this beauty. His mind churned endlessly through his problems, each thought leading to another worry, another reason why his life felt so difficult. Exhausted from walking and thinking, he stopped to rest against what appeared to be an ordinary tree. Its trunk was wide and welcoming, its bark smooth against his back. As he leaned there, catching his breath, he realized how thirsty he had become. "I wish I had something to drink," he murmured to himself. Instantly, as if materializing from thin air, a cup of cool, clear water appeared in his hand. He stared at it in disbelief, turning the cup this way and that, examining it for some trick or illusion. The water looked pure, inviting. Tentatively, he brought it to his lips and drank. It was the most refreshing water he had ever tasted, cool and sweet, exactly what his parched throat needed. "That was strange," he said aloud, but his stomach chose that moment to growl with hunger. Almost without thinking, he wished for food. A simple but nourishing meal appeared before him on a wooden plate: fresh bread, ripe fruit, and vegetables that looked as if they had just been harvested. The aroma made his mouth water. He ate slowly, marveling at each bite. "My wishes are being granted," he whispered in amazement. The realization sent a thrill through his entire body. "Well then," he said with growing excitement, "I wish for a beautiful home of my own." Before his eyes, in the meadow just beyond the tree, a magnificent house materialized. It was everything he had ever dreamed of: spacious rooms filled with light, comfortable furnishings, gardens blooming with flowers. His heart raced with joy as he stood and approached his new home. "If I have such a house," he reasoned, "I'll need help to maintain it." He wished for servants, and immediately several kind-faced people appeared, bowing respectfully and asking how they might serve him. The man laughed with delight, hardly believing his incredible fortune. And what good is a beautiful home without someone special to share it with? He wondered aloud. He wished for a beautiful, loving, intelligent woman to be his companion. A radiant woman appeared beside him, her eyes warm with affection, her smile gentle and knowing. But as she took his hand, something shifted in the man's mind. The rational voice that had whispered doubts throughout his life suddenly grew louder. "Wait a minute," he said, stepping back from the woman. "This is ridiculous. I'm not this lucky. Things like this don't happen to people like me. This can't be real." As the words left his mouth, everything began to fade. The woman's loving smile dissolved first, then the servants, then the beautiful house, and finally even the simple meal he had enjoyed. He found himself alone again, leaning against what now seemed like an ordinary tree, with nothing but his original troubles for company. He shook his head knowingly. "I knew it," he muttered, and walked away through the forest, his mind immediately returning to the familiar patterns of worry and complaint that had occupied him before. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. The heart of this lesson lies in understanding the creative power of belief and the self-sabotaging nature of doubt. Why do we so readily dismiss the good that comes into our lives? Zen Buddhism points to a deeply conditioned pattern in the human mind, the tendency to trust our limitations more than our possibilities. We become so familiar with struggle, so identified with our problems, that abundance feels foreign, even threatening to our sense of self. Consider how often throughout your day you might receive unexpected kindness, notice surprising beauty, or encounter opportunities that could transform your circumstances. How quickly do you dismiss these gifts as coincidence, luck, or too good to be true? This reflexive doubt often causes us to literally walk away from the very blessings we've been seeking. The wishing tree represents the responsive universe that Zen teaches us about, reality that mirrors back our deepest beliefs about what we deserve and what's possible. When we approach life with trust and openness, we often discover resources and opportunities that were always available but previously invisible to us. When we approach with cynicism and self-doubt, these same possibilities seem to vanish. The man in the story had access to everything he needed, but his conditioning told him that someone like him couldn't possibly be worthy of such gifts. His belief in his own limitations became more powerful than the evidence of his senses. This is the tragedy of self-doubt. It causes us to abandon the very solutions to our problems. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement. This paradox points to the balance between accepting our inherent worthiness while remaining open to growth. The man under the tree couldn't hold both truths simultaneously, that he was worthy of good things and that positive change was possible in his life. In our modern context, we encounter wishing trees constantly. The colleague who offers genuine friendship, but we assume they have ulterior motives. The job opportunity that seems perfect, but we convince ourselves we're not qualified. The romantic relationship that feels too good to be true, so we sabotage it before it can disappoint us. Each time we choose familiar limitation over unfamiliar possibility, we walk away from our own wishing tree. The Buddha taught, doubt everything. Find your own light. But there's a crucial distinction between the doubt that leads to wisdom and the doubt that leads to self-defeat. Wise doubt questions, assumptions, and seeks truth. Self-defeating doubt assumes the worst about ourselves and our possibilities, then treats these assumptions as facts. Zen practice invites us to notice when we're dismissing good fortune, abundance, or love simply because it doesn't match our habitual story about ourselves. Can we remain open to the possibility that we might be more deserving, more capable, more lovable than our conditioning suggests? Tonight, as you reflect on the day's experiences, can you identify moments when you might have walked away from your own wishing tree? Perhaps a compliment you dismissed, an opportunity you assumed wasn't meant for you, or a moment of joy you cut short because it felt too good to last. What would it mean to trust in your worthiness to receive life's gifts? As the Buddha observed, thousands of candles can be lit from a single candle, and the life of the candle will not be shortened. Happiness never decreases by being shared. The wishing tree's magic isn't diminished by granting wishes, it's fulfilled by them. And our capacity to receive life's blessings isn't diminished by accepting them, it's expanded. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a story about the difference between resistance and flow. This is the teaching of the old man and the waterfall. In a mountain village where a swift river carved its way through ancient rocks, an old Taoist sage often walked along the water's edge, observing the interplay between the flowing current and the solid stones that tried to redirect its path. The villagers knew him as a gentle, contemplative man who seemed to understand something profound about the natural world that others missed. One afternoon, as storm clouds gathered and rain began to fall, the river swelled with unusual force. The current grew violent and unpredictable, rushing toward a high waterfall that dropped into a rocky gorge below. Most people avoided the area during such conditions, knowing that anyone who fell into the rapids would face almost certain death against the jagged rocks at the bottom of the falls. The old man, however, had been caught by the sudden storm while walking along his usual path. As he tried to make his way back to safety, the muddy bank gave way beneath his feet. Before he could catch himself, he tumbled into the raging torrent and was immediately swept away by the powerful current. Villagers who witnessed his fall cried out in horror. They ran along the riverbank, helplessly watching as the old man was carried toward the waterfall by waters too violent and swift for any rescue attempt. They could only watch in anguish as he disappeared over the edge, plunging into the churning chaos below. Everyone assumed the worst. No one could survive such a fall, especially not an elderly man with limited strength. The villagers prepared themselves to search for his body downstream, once the waters calmed enough to make such a search possible. But to their amazement, as they hurried toward the base of the waterfall, they saw the old man emerging from the water far below, completely unharmed. He walked calmly to the shore, water streaming from his clothes, and sat down to rest as peacefully as if he had simply taken a refreshing swim on a pleasant day. The villagers rushed to him, unable to believe what they had witnessed. "How is this possible?" they asked in wonder. "How did you survive that terrible fall? The water was so violent, the rocks so dangerous. By all reason, you should have been killed." The old man smiled at their concern and amazement. He wrung water from his sleeves and considered their question carefully before answering. "I survived," he said simply, "because I accommodated myself to the water, not the water to me. When I felt myself falling, I did not fight against the current or try to force it to change direction. Without thinking, I allowed myself to be shaped by it. When the water wanted to go down, I went down. When it swirled, I swirled with it. Plunging into the whirlpool, I came out with the whirlpool. I became like the water itself, and this is how I survived." The villagers listened in silence, beginning to understand that they had witnessed something far more than a fortunate accident. They had seen a demonstration of a profound principle that the old man had spent years learning from his careful observation of the natural world. As the Buddha taught, nothing is permanent. Everything is subject to change. Being is always becoming. Here we discover the wisdom of working with life's currents rather than exhausting ourselves in futile resistance to forces beyond our control. Why do we instinctively fight against difficult circumstances when flow and adaptation might serve us better? Zen Buddhism reveals that our ego mind believes it can control external conditions through force of will, but this approach often creates more suffering than the original difficulty. The old man's survival wasn't mere luck, it was the result of understanding something essential about the nature of existence itself. When we align ourselves with the natural flow of events, rather than demanding that life conform to our preferences, we often discover resources and possibilities that resistance makes invisible. Consider your own relationship with challenging circumstances. How much energy do you spend fighting against situations you cannot change? The old man's teaching suggests a different approach. Not passive submission, but conscious adaptation that maintains our essential nature while flowing with changing conditions. This doesn't mean accepting harmful situations or abandoning our values. The old man didn't give up his desire to survive. He simply changed his strategy for survival. Instead of fighting the water's power, he used it. Instead of resisting its direction, he moved with it while maintaining his awareness and intention. In relationships, careers, and personal challenges, we often face similar choices. We can exhaust ourselves trying to force outcomes, control other people's behavior, or make external circumstances conform to our expectations. Or we can learn to work skillfully with what is actually present, finding creative ways to achieve our deeper purposes through accommodation rather than force. Zen master Lao Tzu taught water is fluid, soft, and yielding. But water will wear away rock, which cannot yield and is destroyed. The old man embodied this teaching, demonstrating that apparent weakness can be a source of tremendous strength when applied with wisdom. The Buddha said, "Hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule." This principle extends beyond hatred to all forms of resistance. Problems are rarely solved by fighting against them directly, but by understanding their nature and finding ways to work with the underlying forces involved. Look deeply at a current source of stress or conflict in your life. Where are you trying to force the water to change direction rather than learning to swim with it? What would it mean to accommodate yourself to the situation while maintaining your essential values and intentions? Tonight, as you encounter the inevitable currents of daily life, unexpected changes, difficult people, circumstances beyond your control, can you remember the old man's wisdom? Can you find ways to maintain your center while flowing with forces you cannot change, discovering that sometimes the most direct path to your goals is the one that appears to go around obstacles rather than through them? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Learning to flow with life's currents is ultimately about letting go of our need to control everything while maintaining our ability to respond wisely to whatever arises. Like water, we can be both powerful and yielding, both persistent and adaptive, both strong and gentle. Now, let us explore a story about fearlessness and the power that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. This is the encounter between the general and the Zen master who could not be moved. During the violent civil wars that tore through feudal Japan, armies swept across the countryside like natural disasters, conquering villages and controlling territories through force and intimidation. When word spread that a particular warlord's army was approaching, most people would flee with whatever possessions they could carry, seeking safety in the mountains or with relatives in distant towns. In one small village, as the dreaded army drew near, the familiar pattern repeated itself. Families packed hastily, merchants closed their shops, and within hours the streets that had been busy with daily life stood empty and silent. Everyone had fled, everyone, that is, except the old Zen master who lived in the simple temple at the village center. When the conquering army arrived and found the village deserted, the general was surprised to discover smoke still rising from the temple chimney. Curious about who would have the audacity, or perhaps the foolishness, to remain when everyone else had fled, he decided to investigate this anomaly personally. The general approached the temple with several of his lieutenants, expecting to find either a frail old man too weak to flee, or perhaps someone who had been unable to escape in time. What he found instead was the Zen master sitting peacefully in his garden, tending to his plants, as if nothing unusual was happening around him. The general had grown accustomed to fear and submission wherever his army went. Village leaders would prostrate themselves before him, pleading for mercy and offering tribute in hopes of avoiding destruction. Citizens would cower and flee at the mere sight of his soldiers. This old man's calm indifference to his presence was both puzzling and irritating. When he wasn't treated with the deference and submissiveness to which he was accustomed, the general's face darkened with growing anger. Here was someone who didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation or respect the power he represented. "You fool!" the general shouted, his voice echoing through the empty courtyard as he reached for his sword. His elaborate armor gleamed menacingly in the afternoon light, and his hand gripped his weapon with practiced ease. "Don't you realize that you are standing before a man who could run you through without blinking an eye?" The threat that had terrorized countless others left the master completely unmoved. He continued his careful tending of a small flowering bush, his hands steady and his expression serene. When he finally looked up at the general, it was with the same calm attention he had shown before, as if greeting any ordinary visitor to his garden. "And do you realize," the master replied with perfect equanimity, "that you are standing before a man who can be run through without blinking an eye?" The general stood speechless, his sword half drawn, his anger suddenly dissolved into something approaching awe. In all his years of warfare and conquest, he had encountered many forms of courage, the desperate bravery of cornered soldiers, the defiant rage of defeated enemies, the foolish boldness of young warriors. But he had never encountered anything like this: complete acceptance without fear, total peace in the face of death. The master's response revealed something the general had never considered, that there could be a power greater than the ability to kill, and that was the complete absence of fear about being killed. Here was someone who had so fully accepted the temporary nature of existence that even the threat of immediate death held no power over him. Slowly, the general returned his sword to its sheath. Without another word, he turned and walked away from the temple, leaving the master to continue his gardening in peace. The village remained untouched by the war, not because of any military strategy or negotiated protection, but because of one man's absolute fearlessness. As the Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Strive on with diligence. Here we discover the profound power that emerges when we fully accept this fundamental truth rather than spending our lives trying to escape it. Why does complete acceptance of mortality create such presence and authority? Zen Buddhism reveals that most of our fear comes not from external threats, but from our desperate clinging to what is inherently temporary. When that clinging dissolves, the threats themselves lose their power to disturb our inner peace. The general's power came from others' fear of death and loss. But someone who has fully accepted the temporary nature of existence cannot be threatened with what he has already willingly released. The master's fearlessness wasn't bravado or indifference. It was the natural result of understanding impermanence so completely that even his own death held no terror. Consider your own relationship with threats and intimidation in daily life. How much of your fear comes from attachment to maintaining your current circumstances, preserving your reputation, or protecting your physical comfort? The master's response suggests that true invulnerability comes not from being untouchable, but from having nothing that can be taken away. This doesn't mean being passive or welcoming harm. The master wasn't seeking death or encouraging violence. Rather, his complete acceptance of mortality's inevitability freed him from the paralyzing fear that controls most people when facing genuine danger. The Buddha said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." The master's single response contained more power than any threat because it came from a place of absolute acceptance rather than resistance or fear. Tonight, as you consider the various pressures and threats you face, can you remember the master's profound response to the general's sword? Can you find the space where acceptance of impermanence creates not resignation but a kind of unshakable presence that cannot be intimidated? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, the whole secret of existence is to have no fear. True freedom comes not from avoiding danger, but from understanding so completely that we cannot ultimately be harmed, that external threats become powerless to disturb our essential peace. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us explore a story about contentment and the nature of desire. This is the stonecutter's journey. High in the mountain villages, there lived a simple stonecutter who had discovered the secret of happiness without knowing it. Each dawn, he would climb winding paths to the quarries, his tools balanced across his shoulders. As he worked among the stones, he would sing old mountain songs that echoed across the valleys. Though he was poor by society's measures, living in a modest hut with few possessions, the stonecutter desired nothing more than what he had. His simple life felt complete, the rhythm of his work, the beauty of the mountains, the satisfaction of honest labor. His heart held not a care in the world. One day, he was called to work on the grand mansion of a wealthy nobleman. As he approached the estate, his eyes widened at the magnificence before him. Marble columns reached toward the sky, gardens sprawled in perfect symmetry. For the first time in his life, the stonecutter felt the sharp pang of desire pierce his contentment. "If only I were rich," he sighed. "Then I would not have to earn my living in sweat and toil as I do now." To his amazement, a voice whispered from the stones, "Your wish has been granted. Henceforth, anything you desire will be given to you." He returned home that evening to find his humble hut replaced by a mansion as magnificent as the nobleman's. Overwhelmed with joy, he abandoned his tools and began enjoying the luxurious life of the wealthy. But one hot afternoon, gazing from his ornate window, he saw the king's royal procession passing by. The monarch sat in cool shade, surrounded by noblemen and servants, appearing serene and powerful above the common heat. "How I wish I were a king myself," he thought, and immediately found himself reclining in silk cushions within the royal carriage. But the carriage proved warmer than expected. Even through thick walls, the sun's heat penetrated relentlessly. "I wish I were the sun," he declared, and found himself sending waves of light and heat across the universe. As the sun, he felt magnificent and all-powerful until thick storm clouds gathered, completely blocking his rays. "I wish to be a cloud." And so he became a massive storm cloud, glorying in his power to block the sunday. But as he transformed into falling rain, he encountered an enormous rock that blocked his path completely. A mere rock more powerful than I? I wish to be a rock. Suddenly, he stood tall upon the mountainside, feeling he had achieved true permanence. But soon he heard chipping sounds at his base. Looking down, he saw a tiny human figure cutting chunks of stone away. A puny creature more powerful than me? I want to be a man again. And so he found himself once more a stonecutter, climbing familiar mountain paths. But now something had changed. As he shaped stones and felt mountain breezes, his heart swelled with deep contentment. His song returned, richer than before, because he had learned to be content with exactly who he was. The Buddha once said, "Health is the greatest gift, contentment the greatest wealth." This ancient wisdom illuminates the endless cycle of wanting that keeps us from recognizing the abundance already present in our lives. Why do we chase after different conditions, always believing happiness lies in the next transformation? Each desire fulfilled only reveals the next desire, creating an endless cycle of dissatisfaction. The stonecutter's journey reveals the futility of seeking happiness through external circumstances. Consider your own versions of this cycle. I'll be happy when I get promoted, only to discover new stresses. I'll be content with more money, only to find greater wealth brings new worries. Each achievement reveals the next mountain to climb. Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi said, "Each of you is perfect the way you are, and you can use a little improvement." This paradox points to the heart of contentment, the ability to fully accept what is while still engaging wholeheartedly with life's natural changes. The stonecutter's final transformation wasn't into something greater, but into appreciation for what he had always been. His work remained the same, but his relationship to life was completely transformed. Contentment isn't found in having different experiences, but in bringing different awareness to whatever experiences arise. Tonight, as you notice the mind's habitual reaching toward what's not here, can you experiment with the stonecutter's final wisdom? Can you find the song that emerges when you stop trying to be anything other than what you are? As the Buddha taught, contentment is natural wealth, luxury is artificial poverty. The greatest transformation available isn't becoming something different, but recognizing the inherent completeness of what we already are. Our next story reveals the difference between knowledge and true awareness. This is the tale of the teacher who thought he had arrived. After a decade of intensive training under various masters, studying countless texts and dedicating himself wholly to Zen practice, a monk named Tenno finally achieved what he had long sought: recognition as a qualified teacher. His understanding of Buddhist philosophy was profound, his meditation practice was deep and stable, and his ability to guide others had been tested and approved. He received the formal acknowledgement that he was ready to teach the Dharma and help others along the path of awakening. Proud of his accomplishment and eager to learn from one of the most renowned masters of his time, Tenno decided to visit the famous Zen master Nanin. The older teacher's reputation for wisdom and insight was legendary throughout the region, and Tenno looked forward to engaging in deep Dharma discussions and perhaps receiving some final polishing of his understanding. It was a rainy day when Tenno made his pilgrimage to Nanin's temple. The roads were muddy and slippery, puddles reflected the grey sky, and the steady rainfall required him to carry an umbrella to stay dry. When he reached the temple, he carefully removed his wooden clogs and placed them on the covered porch along with his umbrella, just as custom dictated. He arranged his outer robes, composed himself properly, and entered the temple to meet the great master. Nanin received him graciously, bowing with the respect due to a fellow teacher while maintaining the dignity of his greater experience. They sat together in the simple receiving room, and Tenno expected their conversation to focus on sophisticated points of doctrine, subtle aspects of meditation technique, or perhaps the challenges of guiding students. Instead, after the initial pleasantries, Nanin asked what seemed like an absurdly mundane question. "I noticed you left your wooden clogs and umbrella on the porch when you entered. Tell me, did you place your umbrella to the left of your shoes or to the right?" Tenno was caught completely off guard. Of all the profound topics they could discuss, why was this renowned master asking about such a trivial detail? He tried to recall the moment he had arranged his belongings, but realized with growing dismay that he had no idea. He had been so focused on the importance of this meeting, so preoccupied with the impressive conversation he expected to have, that he had performed the simple act of arranging his belongings in complete unconsciousness. I don't know," Tenno admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. In that moment of confession, the full implications of his ignorance became clear to him. Here he was, a certified teacher of mindfulness and awareness, and he couldn't even remember a simple action he had performed just minutes earlier. Nanin smiled with infinite compassion, not mockery. "Then you have not yet attained full awareness," he said gently. "Someone who is truly awake pays complete attention to every moment, every action, every detail of experience. The way you arrange your belongings reflects the same quality of attention you bring to meditation, to teaching, to all of life." In that instant, Tenno's pride in his accomplishments crumbled, replaced by a humbling recognition of how much deeper his practice needed to go. He understood that true awareness isn't something you achieve once and then possess forever. It's a quality of attention that must be cultivated and maintained in every single moment, in the most ordinary activities as well as the most exalted spiritual practices. Without hesitation, Tenno requested to become Nanin's student. For the next 10 years, he studied under the master's guidance, learning to bring the same quality of conscious attention to placing his shoes that he brought to formal meditation, to treat the arrangement of an umbrella with the same reverence he showed to sacred texts. When he finally left Nanin's temple, he was a completely different kind of teacher, one who understood that enlightenment is not a destination, but a way of traveling, not an achievement, but a continuous practice of complete presence. As the Buddha observed, if you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions. What emerges from this story is the recognition that true spiritual development is measured not by our peak experiences, but by the quality of attention we bring to ordinary moments. Why do we assume that enlightenment exists only in special circumstances, formal practices, or elevated states of consciousness? Zen Buddhism teaches that awakening is found precisely in our ability to be fully present for whatever is actually happening, whether it's sitting in meditation or simply placing an umbrella beside our shoes. Tenno's mistake was common among spiritual practitioners. He had developed the ability to be mindful during designated practice periods, but hadn't yet learned to extend that same quality of awareness to everyday activities. He could be present while sitting in meditation, but unconscious while performing simple tasks. This split between spiritual activities and ordinary activities is one of the most subtle traps on the path of awakening. We imagine that consciousness is something we turn on during meditation and turn off during mundane tasks. But true practice integrates awareness into every aspect of life. Consider your own daily routine. How present are you while brushing your teeth, making coffee, or putting on your shoes? Do you perform these activities with the same quality of attention you might bring to more important tasks? The gap between formal practice and informal practice often reveals where our awareness needs to deepen. Zen master Dogen taught, "Practice and enlightenment are one." This means that the quality of consciousness we cultivate in any moment is both the path and the destination. There's no separation between developing awareness and being aware. Every moment offers a complete opportunity for awakening. Nanin's question wasn't about umbrellas and shoes. It was about whether Tenno's spiritual development had penetrated into the cellular level of his daily existence. Could he maintain the same presence while performing unconscious habits that he brought to conscious spiritual practice? The Buddha said, "Mindfulness is the path to the deathless. Heedlessness is the path to death. Those who are mindful do not die. Those who are heedless are as if dead already." True aliveness is found in complete presence, and complete presence can be cultivated in any activity, no matter how simple or mundane. Look deeply at your own relationship between formal practice and daily life. Where do you treat certain activities as worthy of attention while others are performed on autopilot? This isn't about becoming obsessively focused on every tiny detail, but about recognizing that the same capacity for presence that serves us in meditation can transform every aspect of our lives. The paradox is that the most ordinary moments often offer the greatest opportunities for awakening. When we're sitting in formal meditation, we expect to be mindful. But when we're simply arranging our belongings or performing routine tasks, we have a chance to discover whether our practice has truly taken root or remains confined to special circumstances. In Zen temples, students are taught that washing dishes is as sacred as chanting sutras, that sweeping floors is as important as studying philosophy. This isn't because these activities are inherently special, but because the quality of consciousness we bring to any activity determines its spiritual value. Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "Washing dishes is not only a way to have clean dishes, washing dishes is also a way to live fully in each moment." This points to the fundamental teaching that Nan-in was offering Tenno: every action is an opportunity to practice complete presence. The master's question revealed that Tenno's decade of training had developed his capacity for awareness during designated practice periods, but hadn't yet integrated that awareness into the seamless flow of daily life. He could be conscious when he intended to be conscious, but he hadn't yet learned to make consciousness his default state. This integration is what distinguishes genuine spiritual maturity from mere spiritual knowledge. It's relatively easy to be mindful when we remember to be mindful. The deeper practice is developing the kind of natural awareness that operates whether we're thinking about it or not. Tonight, as you perform the simple actions that end your day, brushing your teeth, changing clothes, arranging items for tomorrow, can you bring the same quality of attention you might give to formal meditation? Can you discover whether your spiritual practice has penetrated into the unconscious habits that make up so much of daily life? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, every moment is a teacher, and every place is a classroom. The umbrella beside the shoes was Tenno's teacher that day, revealing exactly where his practice needed to deepen. Sometimes the most profound lessons come disguised as the most ordinary questions, asked by masters wise enough to see that true awakening is found not in transcending the mundane, but in discovering the sacred hidden within it. As we continue our journey through the wisdom of Zen Buddhism, let us turn to a teaching about the temporary nature of all our possessions and positions. This is the story of the inn that calls itself a palace. In ancient India, a renowned spiritual teacher had spent many years wandering from village to village, sharing the Buddha's teachings with anyone who would listen. His reputation for wisdom and compassion had spread throughout the land, reaching even the ears of kings and nobles. One day, during his travels, he arrived at the capital city of a great kingdom, where a magnificent palace rose above the bustling streets like a jeweled crown. The palace was truly a wonder to behold. Its walls were constructed of the finest marble, inlaid with precious stones that caught and reflected the sunlight in brilliant cascades of color. Gardens filled with exotic flowers and flowing fountains surrounded the structure, and guards in gleaming armor stood at attention throughout the grounds. It was clearly the dwelling of someone who commanded immense wealth and power. The spiritual teacher approached the main entrance with the same calm dignity he brought to every encounter, whether with kings or beggars. The guards, recognizing him by his simple robes and serene presence, made no move to stop him. Word of his arrival had preceded him, and they had been instructed to allow him passage. Walking through corridors lined with silk tapestries and golden statues, the teacher made his way directly to the throne room, where the king sat upon an elaborately carved chair elevated above the marble floor. Courtiers in fine clothes gathered around the throne, their jeweled ornaments glinting in the light from tall windows. The king, a middle-aged man wearing robes of deep purple silk and a crown of gold and diamonds, looked up as the teacher entered. He had been expecting this visit, though he wasn't entirely sure what to expect from their encounter. "What do you want?" the king asked directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate answers and unquestioning obedience. The teacher bowed respectfully, but spoke with quiet confidence. "Your Majesty, I would like a place to sleep in this inn." A ripple of surprise moved through the assembled courtiers. The king's eyebrows rose, and his expression shifted from curiosity to confusion. "But this is not an inn," the king replied, gesturing to the opulent surroundings. "This is my palace. I am the ruler of this kingdom, and this has been the seat of royal power for generations." The teacher nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information carefully. I see. May I ask, Your Majesty, who owned this palace before you? My father, the king replied, his tone becoming slightly defensive. He ruled here for 30 years before his death. This palace was his seat of power, as it is now mine. Ah, the teacher said with genuine interest. And who owned it before him? My grandfather, the king answered, beginning to sense where these questions might lead. He too ruled from this throne. He also is dead. The teacher paused, allowing the weight of these words to settle in the vast throne room. The courtiers had grown quiet, sensing the profound direction of this unusual conversation. Even the king found himself waiting, almost despite himself, for the teacher's response. Finally, the teacher spoke with gentle clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the ornate room. And this place where people live for a short time and then move on, did I hear you say that it is not an inn? The silence that followed was complete. The king sat motionless on his throne, the teacher's words penetrating layers of assumption and identity he had never questioned. The courtiers remained frozen, as if witnessing something beyond their normal understanding of royal protocol and worldly power. The Buddha taught, all conditioned things are impermanent. Work out your salvation with diligence. This profound truth reveals itself in the teacher's penetrating question about the inn that calls itself a palace. Why do we cling so fiercely to possessions and positions that are, by their very nature, temporary? Zen Buddhism explains that our attachment to permanence creates suffering because it conflicts with the fundamental reality of impermanence. Everything we think we own, including our own bodies and identities, we hold only temporarily. Look deeply at your own experience. The house you call yours, the car you drive, the job title you carry, the bank account balance you monitor, all of these are temporary arrangements. You inhabit them for a period of time, then move on, just as others inhabited them before you and will inhabit them after you. This doesn't mean we should become indifferent to our responsibilities or careless with our possessions. Rather, it invites us to hold them more lightly, recognizing their transient nature. The king's palace was indeed magnificent and served important functions, but it was also, unmistakably, an inn where occupants stayed temporarily before departing. The deeper teaching here shows us how identification with temporary roles creates unnecessary suffering. When we forget the impermanent nature of our positions, whether as parent, professional, homeowner, or even student of Zen, we create anxiety trying to maintain what cannot be permanently maintained. Consider your own attachments. Perhaps it's your professional identity, your relationships, your health, or your spiritual achievements. Each of these is precious and worthy of care, but each is also subject to change. The executive becomes retired. The parent becomes empty nester. The student becomes teacher. The healthy person faces illness. These transitions are not failures, but natural expressions of impermanence. Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, thanks to impermanence, everything is possible. This teaching reframes impermanence from something to fear into something to celebrate. Because nothing lasts forever, suffering states can transform into joy, closed hearts can open to love, and even the most entrenched patterns can shift toward wisdom. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called non-attachment, caring deeply while holding lightly. This doesn't mean we become cold or indifferent, but that we learn to love without clinging, to work without grasping, and to enjoy without demanding permanence. The spiritual teacher's insight pierces through the illusion that any of us are permanent owners of anything. We are all temporary guests in the inn of existence, borrowing our roles and possessions for the brief time we inhabit them. This recognition can bring either despair or profound liberation, depending on how we receive it. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "Everything is impermanent. Try to accomplish as much virtue as possible." This teaching encourages us not to waste our temporary time in the inn, but to use it wisely, cultivating love, wisdom, and compassion while we have the opportunity. Tonight, as you rest in your own temporary dwelling, surrounded by your own temporary possessions, can you feel the profound freedom that comes with recognizing their transient nature? 5. Can you sense how this recognition might actually increase your appreciation rather than diminish it? As the Buddha taught, of all footprints, that of the elephant is supreme. Similarly, of all meditative themes, that on death is supreme. By remembering the temporary nature of our stay in this inn called life, we discover the urgency and preciousness of each moment we're given to practice love and awareness. Let us now turn to a tale about the courage to trust life's current. This is the story of the Crystal River. In the depths of a great crystal river, where water flowed clear as mountain air, there lived an entire village of small creatures. The river's current moved above them like a gentle breath, carrying the wisdom of countless springs and distant seas. Young and old, rich and poor, all made their home along the sandy bottom, each creature grasping tightly to stones, branches, and roots. For generations, clinging had been their way of survival. Every creature learned from birth to wrap their appendages around river rocks and fallen wood. "Hold on," the elders would say. "The current is dangerous. It will sweep you away to places unknown. Safety lies in staying exactly where you are." But one small creature grew weary of this endless grasping. Day after day, he watched the current flow overhead, seeing how it moved with such purpose and grace. While his neighbors complained about the effort required to maintain their grip, he found himself wondering what it might feel like to trust that flowing water. "I am tired of clinging," he announced one morning. "Though I cannot see where it leads, I trust that the current knows its destination. I shall let go and allow it to carry me where it will. For I fear that if I continue clinging, I shall die of boredom before I ever truly live." The other creatures gasped in horror. "Fool," they cried. "Let go, and that current will tumble you mercilessly across the rocks below. You will be battered and broken, dying far more quickly than any boredom could kill you." But the small creature had made his decision. Taking one last look at his neighbors, he released his grip on the familiar stone. Immediately, the current seized him, and just as the others had predicted, he was tumbled and tossed across the rocky bottom. His small body struck stone after stone, each impact bringing pain he had never experienced while safely clinging. Yet something remarkable began to happen. As the creature continued to surrender to the current's power, refusing to grab for new anchors despite his pain, the water gradually lifted him higher from the dangerous bottom. The tumbling ceased. The rocks could no longer reach him. Now he flowed with the current itself, no longer fighting its direction, but becoming one with its movement. As he traveled downstream, creatures in distant parts witnessed something they had never seen. Here was one of their own kind, yet he appeared to be flying through the water, moving with the elegant power of the current itself. See a miracle, they called out. A creature like ourselves, yet he soars. Surely he is the Messiah, come to save us all. The flowing creature heard their cries and felt compassion for their misunderstanding. I am no more Messiah than any of you, he called back. The river delights in lifting us all free, if only we dare to let go. Our true work is not clinging to the bottom, but embracing this voyage, this grand adventure of trust and flow. But the creatures only cried louder, Savior! Savior! Even as they spoke, they tightened their grips on rocks and roots. They watched until he disappeared around a bend, then began weaving legends about the miraculous Savior who had briefly graced their village. Buddha's wisdom reminds us, you only lose what you cling to. This ancient teaching illuminates the profound paradox at the heart of human experience. We spend our lives grasping for security and control, believing that our safety depends on holding tight to familiar circumstances. Yet, in this very grasping, we create the suffering we seek to avoid. Why do we cling so desperately when the current offers to carry us toward unknown adventures? Zen Buddhism reveals that from early childhood, we learn the known is safe and the unknown dangerous. This conditioning becomes a spiritual obstacle when it prevents growth beyond familiar limitations. We also suffer from the illusion of control, believing that by grasping circumstances, relationships, and identities, we can stop the natural flow of change. This creates enormous tension because it puts us in opposition to reality itself. Life is constant movement, and when we resist this truth, we exhaust ourselves fighting currents far more powerful than our individual will. Consider the areas of your life where you find yourself clinging. Perhaps it's a relationship that has outgrown its original form, a career that no longer brings joy, or an image of yourself that now constrains your growth. The current of change will flow whether we resist it or not. Our choice is whether to exhaust ourselves in futile opposition or discover the grace available in conscious surrender. The Buddha said, "Nothing is permanent except change." Water doesn't fight the mountainside, it finds the natural pathway down. When we learn to move with life's current rather than against it, we discover effortless effectiveness that rigid resistance can never achieve. Tonight, as you rest in this moment's stillness, what might you be ready to release? Perhaps it's a worry about tomorrow's challenges, a resentment from yesterday's disappointments, or a way of defining yourself that has grown too small. Can you feel into the current of this moment's aliveness and trust its direction? As the Buddha taught, let go of what has passed. Let go of what may come. Let go of what is happening now. Relax right now and rest. In this trust, we discover that the current we feared would destroy us is actually the very force that can carry us home to our true nature. Let us now explore a story about choice, responsibility, and the power we hold in every moment. This is the tale of the young man and the bird. A clever young student had grown tired of his teacher's seemingly wise responses to every question. He was convinced that the old master simply spoke in riddles to appear profound, and he decided to devise a test that would expose what he believed was mere pretense. After thinking for several days, he conceived what he thought was the perfect trap. One morning, the young man caught a small sparrow in the garden. The tiny bird trembled in his cupped hands, its heart beating rapidly against his palms. He held it carefully behind his back as he approached his teacher, who was sitting peacefully in the morning sunlight, reading ancient texts. "Master," the student called out with barely concealed excitement, I have a question that will test your legendary wisdom." The old teacher looked up from his reading with patient, gentle eyes. He had seen this look of mischievous confidence in many students over the years, and he understood the young man's need to challenge authority as part of his own growth and learning. "Please," the teacher said simply, "ask your question." The student stepped closer, keeping the bird hidden behind his back. "Master, I hold a small bird in my hands. Using your great wisdom, tell me, is this bird alive or dead?" The young man felt incredibly clever. He had created what he believed was an impossible situation for his teacher. If the master answered, "alive," he would quickly snap the bird's neck and reveal the dead creature, proving the teacher wrong. If the master answered, "dead," he would simply open his hands and let the living bird fly away, again proving the teacher's lack of true insight. Either way, the student was certain he would expose his teacher's supposed wisdom as nothing more than lucky guessing and philosophical double talk. He waited eagerly for the response that would give him the satisfaction of finally outsmarting the old man. The teacher sat quietly for a long moment, not trying to peer behind the student's back or gather more information. His eyes seemed to look not at the student, but through him, as if perceiving something far deeper than the simple trick being attempted. Finally, with a gentle smile that held both compassion and understanding, the master spoke. "The answer, my young friend, is in your hands." The student stood frozen, his mouth hanging open slightly. In 3 simple words, his elaborate trap had been completely dismantled. The teacher hadn't fallen for either option of the false dilemma. Instead, he had pointed to something far more profound, the fundamental truth that the student himself held the power to determine the outcome. The young man looked down at his hands, still cupped behind his back, feeling the tiny bird's rapid heartbeat against his palms. He realized with startling clarity that the master was right. The bird's fate had never depended on the teacher's answer or supposed wisdom. It had always been entirely in the student's control. More than that, he began to understand that this was true about far more than just this moment. The power to choose life or death, creation or destruction, compassion or cruelty, all of it was always in his hands, in every situation, every day. Slowly, the young man brought his hands forward and opened them. The small bird sat still for just a moment, as if gathering itself, then spread its wings and flew into the blue sky, disappearing among the trees. Buddha's wisdom teaches us, we are what we think. All that we are arises with our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make the world. This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound responsibility that comes with conscious choice and the recognition that we are always the architects of our own experience. Why do we so often look outside ourselves for answers that can only be found within? Zen Buddhism points to our tendency to seek authority figures who will tell us what to do, what to think, what to choose. But the deepest teaching is that true wisdom cannot be given from one person to another. It can only be discovered through our own conscious engagement with life. The student's questions seemed to be about the teacher's insight, but it was actually about his own power. He was so focused on proving the master wrong that he almost missed the profound truth being offered, that every moment presents us with choices that shape not only our immediate circumstances, but our character and destiny. Consider your own daily decisions, both large and small. How often do you wait for someone else to tell you what the right choice is? How frequently do you seek permission, approval, or guidance for decisions that ultimately rest entirely in your own hands? The young man's bird represents all the power we hold but sometimes fail to recognize. In our relationships, careers, and spiritual development, we constantly face moments where we hold something precious in our hands: the well-being of others, our own integrity, opportunities for growth or destruction. The outcome depends not on external circumstances or other people's wisdom, but on what we choose to do with the power we possess. The Master's response reveals something crucial about authentic teaching. True teachers don't give answers, they point us back to our own capacity for wisdom. They help us recognize the choices we're already making and the power we already possess, rather than encouraging dependence on their authority. Zen teacher Charlotte Joko Beck said, "We are always in choice, even when we think we're not." The bird in the student's hands represents all the moments when we convince ourselves we have no options, no power, no responsibility. But consciousness always involves choice, and choice always involves responsibility. Look deeply at a current challenge in your life. Where are you waiting for someone else to provide answers, solutions, or direction? What would change if you fully recognize that the power to shape the outcome is already in your hands? This doesn't mean you have control over all external circumstances, but you always have choice about how you respond. The Buddha taught, "The mind is everything. What you think, you become." Every thought, every intention, every action is like the student's choice with the bird, an opportunity to create life or death, beauty or suffering, wisdom or ignorance. The answer is always in our hands. Tonight, as you consider the various situations in your life where you seek guidance or feel powerless, can you sense the truth the Master was pointing to? Can you feel the weight of the choices you carry every day, not as a burden, but as the fundamental dignity of conscious existence? As the Buddha observed, no one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. The bird flies free not because of the teacher's wisdom, but because of the student's choice. In recognizing our own power to choose life over death, compassion over cruelty, truth over deception, we discover that the answer to every important question has always been in our hands. Our next story reveals the power of returning to what is real when fear threatens to overwhelm us. This is the tale of the captured warrior. In ancient Japan, during a time of constant warfare between rival clans, a skilled warrior found himself on the losing side of a fierce battle. As his comrades fell around him and defeat became inevitable, he was captured by enemy soldiers and dragged away from the battlefield, his armor stripped, his weapons confiscated. That evening, they threw him into a dark, cramped prison cell with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. The heavy wooden door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through his bones. As darkness settled over the prison, the warrior's mind began to race with terrifying possibilities. Tomorrow, they would come for him. He knew the customs of war. First would come the interrogation, designed to extract information about his lord's defenses, troop movements, and strategic plans. When he refused to speak, as honor demanded, they would resort to torture. Hot iron, bamboo splinters under his fingernails, methods he had heard described in hushed tones by other warriors. And when they had extracted what they could, or when they grew tired of his silence, would come the execution. As these thoughts consumed him, his heart began to pound so violently he feared it might burst. His breathing became shallow and rapid. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool night air. Sleep seemed impossible as his mind conjured increasingly vivid scenarios of tomorrow's suffering. Hours passed in this torment. The warrior paced his small cell, sat against the cold stone wall, lay on the straw-covered floor. Nothing brought relief from the visions of impending doom that played repeatedly in his mind like a terrible dream he couldn't escape. Then, in the depths of his despair, he remembered the gentle voice of his Zen master back at the monastery where he had studied before becoming a warrior. The old teacher's words came to him as clearly as if the master was sitting beside him in the cell. Tomorrow is not real. It is an illusion. The only reality is now. At first, the warrior's frightened mind resisted these words. How could tomorrow be an illusion when the threats were so concrete, so inevitable? But as he sat quietly and allowed the teaching to penetrate deeper, something began to shift. He noticed his breathing. In this moment, he was breathing freely. He felt the straw beneath him, rough but not uncomfortable. He heard the sound of wind moving through the trees outside his window, a sound that spoke of the natural world continuing its ancient rhythms regardless of human conflict. In this moment, he was not being tortured. In this moment, he was not dying. In this moment, there was simply a man sitting in a cell, alive and aware. The terrors that had seemed so overwhelming moments before revealed themselves to be nothing more than thoughts about a future that existed only in his imagination. As this understanding deepened, a profound peace settled over the warrior. His breathing slowed and deepened. His racing heart found a steady rhythm. For the first time since his capture, he smiled. The master's wisdom had freed him from a prison far more confining than the stone walls around him, the prison of anxious thoughts about tomorrow. Within minutes, the warrior fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. The Buddha once said, "If you want to know your past, look at your present condition. If you want to know your future, look at your present actions." This ancient wisdom illuminates the profound truth the warrior discovered in his cell. The only moment in which we ever actually live is this one. Why do we torture ourselves with endless scenarios about the future? Zen Buddhism explains that our minds evolved as survival mechanisms, constantly scanning for threats and planning for protection. While this capacity serves us in genuine emergencies, it becomes a source of suffering when we mistake mental projections for reality. Look deeply at your own experience. How much of your anxiety stems from vivid imaginings of future scenarios that may never occur? The presentation you're worried about, the medical test results you're awaiting, the difficult conversation you need to have, these situations exist primarily in thought, not in present reality. The warrior's teaching shows us that we can acknowledge future challenges without being consumed by them. Planning and preparation have their place, but when they transform into obsessive worry, they rob us of peace and clarity. As Vietnamese Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh taught, "Thanks to impermanence, everything is possible." The future remains unwritten, shaped by causes and conditions we cannot fully predict or control. The worried mind assumes that current difficulties will inevitably continue or worsen, but impermanence teaches us that everything changes. The warrior in his cell could not know what the next day would actually bring. Perhaps his lord's forces would mount a rescue. Perhaps his captors would show mercy. Perhaps diplomatic negotiations would secure his release. Buddha spoke of this when he said, "The past is gone, the future is not yet here, and there is only one moment for you to live." This teaching doesn't encourage us to ignore future responsibilities or avoid reasonable planning. Instead, it invites us to recognize where our attention habitually goes and to gently guide it back to the richness of present experience. In Zen practice, we cultivate what's called beginner's mind, approaching each moment with fresh awareness rather than predetermined anxiety. When we truly inhabit the present, we often discover that it contains resources for peace and clarity that worried thinking never revealed. Consider how the warrior's shift in attention transformed his entire experience. The same cell, the same uncertain future, but by returning to present moment awareness, suffering transformed into peace. This transformation is available to us in every moment of anxiety or fear. Tonight, as you notice your mind creating stories about tomorrow's challenges, remember the captured warrior and his master's wisdom. What is actually happening right now? What simple experiences, breathing, sitting, the temperature of the air, are available to anchor you in reality rather than imagination? As the Buddha taught, do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future, concentrate the mind on the present moment. In this teaching lies the key to the warrior's prison and our own. Let us now explore a tale about mastery that transcends technique. This is the skill of the butcher. Lord Wenhui was known throughout his domain for appreciating excellence in all its forms. Whether observing musicians, craftsmen, or artists, he had developed a refined eye for recognizing true mastery when he encountered it. One day, while visiting the kitchens of his estate, he stopped to watch his cook, a man named Ding, prepare meat for the evening's feast. What Lord Wenhui witnessed was unlike anything he had ever seen before. Cook Ding was butchering an enormous ox, but his movements were so graceful and fluid that the work appeared more like a sacred dance than a mundane kitchen task. Every gesture flowed seamlessly into the next. Each touch of his hand, every lean of his shoulder, each step of his feet, and every bend of his knee moved in perfect rhythm and harmony. The blade of Ding's knife moved through the animal with an almost musical quality, making soft whispers as it found its way between joints and around bones. The massive ox seemed to fall apart effortlessly under his touch, as if the meat and bones were dissolving like clouds dispersing in a gentle wind. There was no hacking, no struggling, no force applied anywhere, just smooth, continuous motion that made the entire process appear almost magical. This is absolutely marvelous, Lord Wenhui exclaimed, unable to contain his amazement. Such incredible skill could only come from a lifetime of dedicated practice and study. You must have worked for decades to achieve this level of mastery. Cook Ding paused in his work, setting down his knife respectfully, and turned to face his lord. His manner was humble despite his obvious expertise, and he spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered something profound through his craft. What I truly care about, Ding replied thoughtfully, goes far beyond mere technical skill or years of practice. What guides my work is the way itself, the natural order that underlies all existence and transcends any particular technique or method. He continued with growing enthusiasm for explaining his discovery. When I first began cutting up oxen many years ago, all I could see was the massive, solid body of the animal before me. It seemed like an overwhelming challenge, and I had to fight against the meat and bones with considerable effort and struggle. After 3 years of daily practice, he went on, something began to shift in my perception. I no longer saw just the whole ox as one overwhelming mass. I began to distinguish different parts, to understand the animal's structure, to recognize patterns in how the body was organized. Cook Ding's voice took on an almost mystical quality as he described his deepest realization. But now, After many more years, I no longer rely on my eyes to guide the work, nor do I depend on conscious thought to direct my movements. My physical senses step aside, and my spirit moves naturally where it needs to go. I have learned to follow the inherent structure of the animal rather than imposing my will upon it. He gestured toward the partially butchered ox with obvious reverence for his craft. I follow the natural lines that already exist within the body, moving through the large spaces between joints, guiding my knife through the openings that are already there, and working in harmony with the way things actually are, rather than fighting against them. I never force my blade against ligaments or tendons, Ding explained, and I never struggle with the major joints. The knife flows through the natural spaces, finding paths that require no resistance or violence. A mediocre cook might change his knife once a month because he hacks and forces his way through the work. Even a good cook needs a new blade once a year because he still cuts rather than flows. Cook Ding picked up his knife and showed it to Lord Wenhui with evident pride. I have used this same knife for 19 years now and have butchered thousands of oxen with it. Yet look, the blade is still as sharp and clean as the day it came from the stone. This is because there are natural spaces between all the joints, and the blade of a knife has no thickness. When you insert something that has no thickness into spaces that are already there, there is always plenty of room to work. This is why, after all these years, my knife remains perfect. Lord Wenhui stood in silence for several moments, recognizing that he had witnessed something far more profound than exceptional butchering technique. He had seen a demonstration of what it means to work in complete harmony with the natural way of things, to achieve mastery by surrendering to rather than conquering the task at hand. The Buddha taught, when we know ourselves to be connected to all others, acting compassionately is simply the natural thing to do. This ancient wisdom reveals how true mastery emerges not from force, but from understanding our relationship to the whole. Here we discover a profound teaching about the difference between technical skill and wisdom in action. Cook Ding had transcended mere proficiency to embody a way of working that aligned completely with natural principles rather than fighting against them. This story points us toward understanding how genuine mastery in any field, whether spiritual practice, relationships, creative work, or daily activities, comes not from imposing our will but from learning to work with the inherent intelligence present in any situation. Cook Ding's knife remained sharp because he never used it to force his way through resistance, but instead found the natural openings that were already available. Why do we often approach challenges through force rather than flow? Our conditioning teaches us that achievement requires struggle, that we must overcome obstacles through determination and effort. While dedication and practice are certainly necessary, Cook Ding's example reveals a more sophisticated understanding of how mastery actually develops. Consider how this teaching might apply to your own areas of skill or growth. In relationships, we might try to force conversations or change people's perspectives through argument and persuasion rather than finding the natural openings for understanding and connection. In creative work, we might struggle against our material instead of discovering what wants to emerge naturally from our engagement with it. The progression Cook Ding described, from seeing only the whole ox, to distinguishing parts, to moving beyond visual perception entirely, mirrors the development of wisdom in any domain. Initially, we encounter situations as overwhelming wholes that we must attack with crude methods. Gradually, we develop enough understanding to see component parts and relationships. Eventually, if we persist with proper attention, we may transcend analytical thinking entirely and begin to work from a place of intuitive wisdom. This doesn't mean abandoning careful study or disciplined practice. Cook Ding had clearly developed exceptional technical knowledge through years of dedicated work. But he had allowed this knowledge to transform into something deeper, a felt sense of how to move in harmony with the natural order rather than against it. Zen master Dogen wrote, "Time is not separate from you, and as you are present, time does not go away." Cook Ding had discovered this same principle in his craft. By being completely present to the work at hand, he found the timeless spaces between joints where his knife could move effortlessly. This teaching extends to how we approach difficult conversations, creative projects, physical challenges, or spiritual practice. Instead of approaching each situation as a problem to be conquered, we can learn to sense the natural openings, the places where gentle movement is possible, the inherent structure that can guide our actions. The Buddha said, "However many holy words you read, however many you speak, what good will they do you if you do not act upon them?" Cook Ding embodied the holy words through his actions, demonstrating that any activity can become a spiritual practice when approached with the right understanding. Tonight, as you consider the challenges you'll face tomorrow, can you imagine approaching them with Cook Ding's wisdom? Instead of immediately looking for what you need to overcome or force through, might you first sense for the natural openings, the spaces where gentle movement is possible? As the Buddha taught, just as a mother would protect her only child with her life, even so let one cultivate a boundless love towards all beings. Perhaps true mastery is learning to work with such care and sensitivity that we honor the inherent nature of whatever we encounter, finding the way that preserves both our own sharpness and the integrity of what we're working with. Let us continue our journey with a story about the transformative power of fearlessness and unconditional compassion. This is the tale of the thief and the Zen master. One quiet evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Zen master Shichiri Kojun sat in his simple home, reciting ancient sutras. His voice flowed rhythmically through the peaceful rooms, each word a meditation, each breath a prayer. The soft glow of candlelight danced across the walls as he immersed himself completely in the sacred texts, finding deep tranquility in the familiar verses. Suddenly, the serenity was shattered. The front door burst open with a violent crash, and a desperate man entered, brandishing a sharp sword that gleamed menacingly in the candlelight. His eyes were wild with desperation, his clothes dirty and torn, his breathing heavy from running. He had clearly chosen this isolated house because he believed it would be an easy target. A peaceful monk would offer no resistance. "Money or your life?" the thief demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and aggression. He expected the old man to cower, to plead, to scramble frantically for whatever valuables he might have hidden away. But Shichiri didn't even look up from his sutra book. His voice remained calm and steady as he continued reciting for a moment before pausing to address the intruder. "Please, don't disturb my practice," he said, with the same gentle tone he might use to ask someone to close a door. "If you need money, help yourself. It's in that drawer over there." He gestured casually toward a simple wooden chest, then immediately returned to his recitation as if nothing unusual had occurred. The thief stood frozen, his sword still raised, completely bewildered. In all his years of stealing, he had never encountered such a reaction. No fear, no pleading, no anger, just matter-of-fact helpfulness, as if he were a neighbor who had stopped by to borrow something. Shaking his head in confusion but proceeding with his business, the thief moved to the indicated drawer and began gathering the coins and small valuables he found there. The soft sound of the master's voice continued behind him, reciting sacred words as peacefully as if he were alone. Just as the thief was preparing to leave with his stolen goods, the master's voice called out again. "Wait," Shichiri said, finally looking up from his book. "Please don't take everything. I need some of that money to pay my taxes tomorrow. Leave a little for me, won't you?" The thief stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who was being robbed, calmly negotiating the terms of his own robbery as if they were conducting normal business. Almost without thinking, the thief returned some of the money to the drawer. As he turned to leave, certain that this strange encounter was finally over, the master's voice stopped him once more. "You took my money," Shichiri called out, his tone carrying a note of reproach. "And you didn't even thank me. That's quite rude, don't you think?" This final comment left the thief completely speechless. His sword hand began to shake. Never, in his most violent encounters, had he been so thoroughly unnerved. Here was a man who treated robbery as if it were a favor, who was more concerned about politeness than personal safety. "Thank you," the thief stammered, and then fled into the night as quickly as his legs would carry him. Later, when the thief was caught and confessed to numerous crimes, including the incident at Shichiri's house, the master was called as a witness. The court officials expected him to demand justice, to describe the terror and violation he had experienced. Instead, Shichiri spoke with the same calm clarity he had shown that evening. "This man did not steal anything from me," he testified. "I gave him the money freely. He even thanked me for it, though it took a little reminding." The thief, sitting in chains, felt something break open in his chest as he heard these words. This man had not only shown him extraordinary kindness in the moment of the crime, but was now protecting him from the consequences. For the first time in years, tears came to his eyes, not tears of self-pity or anger, but tears of recognition. He had encountered something he had never experienced before, love without conditions. Upon his release from prison, the former thief sought out the master and begged to become his student. Under Shichiri's patient guidance, he learned to cultivate the same fearless compassion he had witnessed that night. Years later, through dedicated practice and the master's unwavering belief in his potential for transformation, he attained the deep peace and wisdom of enlightenment. As the Buddha observed, hatred does not cease by hatred, but only by love. This is the eternal rule. What emerges from this story is the revolutionary power of meeting violence with absolute peace, responding to taking with giving, and answering fear with love. Why do we instinctively believe that force must be met with force, that aggression requires defensive reaction? Zen Buddhism reveals that this pattern, while natural, often perpetuates the very conflicts it seeks to resolve. When we respond to hostility with hostility, we simply escalate the cycle of suffering. But when we respond with genuine compassion, not passive submission, but active love, we create space for transformation that wouldn't otherwise exist. Look deeply at your own experience. When someone approaches you with anger, criticism, or demand, what is your automatic response? Most of us immediately mobilize our defenses, preparing to protect ourselves through counterattack or withdrawal. But notice what happens in your body and mind during these defensive reactions. Does the tension decrease or increase? Does the conflict resolve or intensify? In Zen practice, we cultivate what might be called the courage of defenselessness. This doesn't mean being naive about genuine danger or allowing ourselves to be harmed unnecessarily. Rather, it means developing the confidence to respond to difficult situations from our highest wisdom rather than our most primitive instincts. The Buddha taught, in the end, just three things matter: how well we have lived, how well we have loved, how well we have learned to let go. Shichiri embodied all three in his encounter with the thief. He lived from complete presence, loved without conditions, and let go of any attachment to his possessions or even his personal safety. Consider the people in your life who challenge you: the difficult colleague, the critical family member, the aggressive driver in traffic. What would it mean to meet their energy with the same kind of fearless compassion Shichiri showed, not by agreeing with them or submitting to their demands, but by refusing to match their level of reactivity, by staying connected to your own center of peace regardless of their behavior? Tonight, as you encounter your own moments of tension or conflict, can you remember the master who treated a robber as an honored guest? Can you find the space between stimulus and response where choice lives, where you can decide to meet aggression with peace, taking with giving, fear with love? Buddha's wisdom reminds us, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. Sometimes the most powerful response to violence is simply to remain unshakable in our commitment to compassion, knowing that love has a transformative power that force can never match. And so we reach the end of these gentle teachings, each one a quiet reminder of what you've always known. Like those ancient Zen masters sitting in their temple gardens, you've discovered that peace was